If you're harmless, you're not virtuous. You're just harmless. You're like a rabbit. A rabbit isn't virtuous. It just can't do anything except get eaten. It's not virtuous. If you're a monster and you don't act monstrously, then you're virtuous. But you also have to be a monster. Well, you see this all the time. Harry Potter's like that too. It's like he's flawed, he's hurt, he's got evil in him. He can talk to snakes, man. He breaks rules all the time. All the time. He's not obedient at all. But, you know, he has a good reason for breaking the rules. And if he couldn't break the rules, him and his little clique of rule-breaking, you know, troublemakers, if they didn't break the rules, they wouldn't attain the highest goal. So it's very peculiar, but it's a very, 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 very common mythological notion. You know, the hero has to be a monster, but a controlled monster. Batman is like that, you know. I mean, it's everywhere. It's the story you always hear. Someone who is incapable of cruelty is a higher moral being than someone who is capable of cruelty. And I would say, and this follows Jung as well, that that's incorrect, and it's dangerously incorrect, because if you are not capable of cruelty, you are absolutely a victim to anyone who is. And so part of the reason that people go watch anti-heroes and villains is because there's a part of them crying out for the incorporation of the monster within them, which is what gives them strength of character and self-respect, because it's impossible to respect yourself until you grow teeth. And if you grow teeth, then you realize that you're somewhat dangerous, or maybe somewhat seriously dangerous, and then you might be more willing to demand that you treat yourself with respect and other people do the same thing. And so that doesn't mean that being cruel is better than not being cruel. What it means is that being able to be cruel and then not being cruel is better than not being able to be cruel. Because in the first case, you're nothing but weak and naive. And in the second case, you're dangerous, but you have it under control. And you know, a lot of martial arts concentrate on exactly that as part of their philosophy of training. It's like, we're not training you to fight. We're training you to be peaceful and awake and avoid fights. But if you happen to have to get in one, and I guess the philosophy also is that if you're competent at fighting, that actually decreases the probability that you're going to have to fight, because when someone pushes you, you'll be able to respond with confidence, and with any luck, and this is certainly the case with bullies, with any luck, a reasonable show of confidence, which is very much equivalent to a show of dominance, is going to be enough to make the bully back off. And so the strength that you develop in your monstrousness is actually the best guarantee of peace. And that's partly why Jung believed that it was necessary for people to integrate their shadow. And he said that was a terrible thing for people to attempt, because the human shadow, which is all those things about yourself that you don't want to realize, reaches all the way to hell. And what he meant by that was, it's through an analysis of your own shadow that you can come to understand why other people are capable, and you as well, of the sorts of terrible atrocities that characterized, let's say, the 20th century. And without that understanding, there's no possibility of bringing it under control. When you study Nazi Germany, for example, or you study the Soviet Union, particularly under Stalin, and you're asking yourself, well, what are these perpetrators like? Forget about the victims, let's talk about the perpetrators. The answer is, they're just like you. And if you don't know that, that just means that you don't know anything about people, including yourself. And then it also means that you have to discover why they're just like you. And believe me, that's no picnic. So that's enough to traumatize people, and that's partly why they don't do it. And it's also partly why the path to enlightenment and wisdom is seldom trod upon, because if it was all a matter of following your bliss and doing what made you happy, then everyone in the world would be a paragon of wisdom. But it's not that at all. It's a matter of facing the thing you least want to face.
You write in the book, there is no faith and no courage and no sacrifice in doing what is expedient. What do you say to those viewers that don't pursue their dreams and are locked in their careers because they are too afraid to to take risks and pursue something meaningful?
Well, the first thing I would say is, well, you should be afraid of taking risks and pursuing something meaningful. But you should be more afraid of staying where you are if it's making you miserable. You're paying a price by sitting there being miserable. You might say, well, the devil I know is better than the one I don't. It's like, don't be so sure of that. The clock is ticking.
Yeah,
and if you're miserable in your job now and you change nothing, in 5 years, you'll be much more miserable and you'll be a lot older.
But isn't it a luxury to pursue what is meaningful? Our viewers have mortgages, they have children,
Yeah.
they have payments and loans. It's
Well,
a luxury to pursue because we lack the resources.
Well, I don't remember now, I'm not talking about what makes you happy. It's a luxury to pursue what makes you happy. It's a moral obligation to pursue what you find meaningful. And that doesn't mean it's easy. It might require sacrifice. If you need to change your job too, let's say you have a family and children and a mortgage, you have responsibilities. You've already picked up those responsibilities. You don't just get to walk away scot-free and say, well, I don't like my job, I quit. That's no strategy. But what you might have to do is you think, well, this job is killing my soul. All right, so what do I have to do about that? Well, I have to look for another job. Well, no one wants to hire me. It's like, okay, maybe you need to educate yourself more. Maybe you need to update your curriculum vitae, your resume. Maybe you need to overcome your fear of being interviewed. Maybe you need to sharpen your social skills. Like, you have to think about these things strategically. If you're going to switch careers, you have to do it like an intelligent, responsible person. That might take you a couple of years of effort to do properly. We're built for struggle, us human beings. We're built to contend with the world. We're built to contend with reality. You want a challenge, and the best way that you can take on a challenge, because a challenge fortifies you. So you don't want to be secure, you want to be strong. And you get strong by taking on optimal challenges. And so you lay out your destiny in the world, and you take the slings and arrows of fate, and you make yourself stronger while you're doing so. And you might fail, and fortune might do you in, but it's your best bet. And, you know, people have extracted unbelievable successes out of catastrophic failures. And so, and I'm not saying that in a naive way. I know perfectly well what happens to people. You know, you're doing fine in life and then you get cancer. And then 6 months later, you're dead. And all the heroism in the world isn't going to save you at that point. But that's not the point. That's not the point. Life is bounded by mortality. But that doesn't mean that you don't get out there and contend. And you develop by contending, and you minimize the net amount of suffering in the world. And that's something, man. That's something to do.
There's a book. It's a book called About Face. It's about a guy that was in the Korean War and then he was in the Vietnam War, and his name is Colonel David Hackworth. When I was on deployment, I would open up that book anywhere and I would read 2 pages or 3 pages before I'd go to bed if I was in my bed that night. And there were so many lessons that correlated to what I was actually going through. And a real obvious example was, when you read, you can learn, and you don't have to go through the school of hard knocks. You don't have to get punched in the face repeatedly with things that turn out to be situations that other people have absolutely gone through. The level of capability increases so much by seeing something one single time. Well, if I see something one time, I'm infinitely better than if I'd never seen it before. It's like those little puzzles. They give you a little puzzle, some kind of a mind bender, right? The mind benders only work on you one time. The riddle only works on you one time. Then you go, I know the answer to that. That's the answer. You never get fooled by that again. So just seeing it one time, you're infinitely better. So when you read enough, you're capturing all these lessons.
Of course, you want to put the book on. You want to become that person. That can rattle you up, man. Especially if the person is thinking all sorts of things that you've never thought. I mean, I love reading for that reason. I could pick my peers too, which I really loved. It's like, well, you know, I have these people around me, but then there's these people who've lived before me and in different places, and I can set them up on my shelf. I can enter into their world, and I can benefit from everything they've thought and saturate myself with that person. It's very disruptive, especially if the person that you're reading has a mind that's more powerful and more well-developed than your own. It was very disruptive, but unbelievably useful to try on other people like that. And you get the benefit of their entire life distilled into their book. You know, it's 30 years of work. I read this one book called The Neuropsychology of Anxiety, which is it's a great scientific work. It's a very hard book. I think it has 1,800 references, something like that. And this guy, Jeffrey Gray, he actually read all those references and he understood them. And so it took me 6 months to read the book, but I got an entire education out of it. I got to experience in 6 months what it took him 30 years to learn. Like, what a gift that is. It's unbelievable. What were you reading when you were in university? Was it fiction, novels? Was it nonfiction? What were you focusing on?
As trite as this may sound, it was actually the most impact was from Shakespeare. It was the most impact on multiple levels. And I'll tell you the primary level. And when I've covered Shakespeare on my podcast, I explain this to people. People think, well, you know, I didn't really understand. I read it, I didn't understand it. If you think you're going to just pick up Shakespeare, open it up and read it and understand it, you're not going to, because it's barely written in English. It's barely written in English. It's almost another language. So what you have to do is you have to start to interpret it. And so what I realized with Shakespeare is, number one, the weight of the words, that these words were so pregnant with meaning that you had to pull those words and parse those words and pull those words apart to see all the depth that each individual word had, and then the way that they're put together. And what was great about this was, by the time I was back, because then I went right back into the SEAL teams, and somebody would hand me a rules of engagement document that was written by some lawyer in Washington, D.C., and I'd pull it out and say, wait a second, this word, I don't know what this word means. So let's pull this word out. Let's see what this actual definition of this particular word is, and how that changes my viewpoint of these rules of engagement, and how can I translate that for my troops so that they actually know what to do. So that part for me was, from a reading perspective, starting to read Shakespeare and saying, oh, okay, you're not going to understand this. And if you don't understand something, that's okay. You pull out the Oxford English Dictionary and you look it up. And then you not just find out what the meaning of the word is, but what's the root word and where does it come from and what kind of depth and what kind of...
Yeah, and that's really, that's unbelievably useful too. Virtually every word is like that, because a word is an ancient artifact. It's like an animal in some sense. It has an evolutionary history and it transforms across time. And each word it carries the echoes of its past with it too, because each word attracts other words in a particular unique way. So it kind of lives in a word ecosystem as well. And the ecosystem contains information about the history of that word. And you think, well, why is that important? It's like, well, hey, guess what? You think in words, you talk in words, you have all these archaic entities, these words, these living entities that you use. It's like the more you know about them, the more you know about you, the more you know about other people, and the better you are at formulating and communicating your ideas. There's nothing lost in that kind of investigation. There's nothing but gain there.
Now, this young man told me that his life lacked purpose and direction and meaning, and that he was nihilistic until he read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which is a book I actually like quite a bit. I've read it 3 times at different decades of my life. And one of the things that's very interesting about that book is that it's an examination of the idea of quality, of the idea that there are qualitative distinctions between things, and that we have an instinct to make qualitative distinctions. And so a qualitative distinction is simply, this is better than that, which is a judgment. Okay, now what Ratzinger is hypothesizing is that the person in and of, you know how the modern idea is you're supposed to accept yourself. I think that's an insane idea, by the way. Really, I can't think of a more nihilistic idea than that you're already okay. It's like, no, you're not. And the reason you're not is because you could be way more than you are. And so what do you want to be? You want to be okay as you are? Or do you want to strive towards what's better? And this young man, this Australian, he said that the reason that Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance had such an impact on him was because he wasn't happy with his current mode of being, right? He didn't consider the manner in which he conducted himself sufficient. And the fact that the author of Zen, and it was Pirsig, laid out the notion that you could make qualitative distinctions, and there really was a difference between good things and bad things, or great things and evil things. It gives you direction. It gives you the possibility of moving upward. And Ratzinger is pointing out, at least to some degree, that human beings are insufficient in and of themselves and need the movement upward. And so they need to conceptualize something like the highest good, and then to strive for that. And the thing is that there isn't any difference between conceptualizing the good and being judged. Because if you're going to conceptualize the good and move towards it, what you have to do is separate from yourself all those things that aren't good and leave them behind. And that's why the Redeemer and the Judge are the same thing. And one of the things that's really appalling, I think, about our modern world is that we're rejecting the notion of qualitative distinctions. You say, well, we don't want to hurt anybody's feelings by saying that one thing is better than another. It's like, okay, fair enough. It's not fun to be cast off with the damned, that's for sure. But if people are in fact insufficient in their present condition, which seems to be the case, I mean, try finding someone who isn't, then if you deny the possibility of qualitative distinction because you want to promote a radical egalitarianism, then you remove the possibility of redemption, because there's no movement towards the good. And it seems to me that it's a catastrophe to sacrifice the good for, well, it's a catastrophe to sacrifice the good for the equal. Because for us to be equal would mean, as far as I can tell, that we would all be equally unredeemed and miserable.
The internal problem is, how do you deal with tragedy and malevolence? And you can say, well, I'm not prepared. It's like, yeah, fair enough. Unsurprising, especially if you were overprotected as a child. It's not a good idea to overprotect your kids, because the snakes are going to come into the garden no matter what you do. And so then you, instead of trying to keep the damn snakes away, what you do is you arm your child with something that can help them chop them into pieces and make the world out of them. So that the trick for human thriving in the face of suffering and malevolence is strength, not protection. It's a completely different idea. We also know this clinically. We know, for example, that if you treat people with exposure therapy for agoraphobia, which is, roughly speaking, the fear of chaos, I would say, the fear of everything, you don't make them less afraid. You make them braver. It's not the same thing. Because with an agoraphobic, see, what happens to them is the fall. They never conceptualize death and suffering. They're naive, right? It never enters the theater of their imagination, and it's because they're protected from it. But then something happens. This often happens to women in their 40s, because they're the people most likely to develop agoraphobia. Something happens. They've been protected from chaos by authority their entire life. So maybe they had an overprotective father, and then they went to an overprotective boyfriend, and then they went to an overprotective husband. And maybe they were willing to be subjugated to all three of those because of the protection, right? So that's the bargain. They stay weak and dependent, and maybe they have to, because that's the only way they can appeal to the person who's hyperprotective. But the price they pay for that is that they're not sufficiently competent. And then something happens in their life, often in their 40s. They develop heart palpitations, maybe as a consequence of menopause. Their heart starts to beat erratically, and they think, oh no, death. It's like, well, who are you going to talk to about that? Right? There's no protection from authority for that. Or maybe their friend gets divorced, or maybe their sister dies, or something like that. It brings up the specter of mortality, and maybe the specter of malevolence and mortality, and it brings it up in a way that authority, recourse to authority, cannot solve. And so then they have panic attacks. What happens? They go out, they get afraid, they feel their heart beating, then they get afraid of their heart beating because they think, oh no, I'm going to die, and they think, oh no, I'm going to die, and I'm going to make a fool of myself while I'm doing it and attract a lot of attention. So the two big fears come up: mortality and social judgment. And then they have a panic attack. It's like fight or flight's gone out of control. Very, very unpleasant. Then they start to avoid the places they've had a panic attack. Then they end up not being able to go anywhere. So then Tiamat has come back, right? A huge monster, a little victim. And so what do you do with them? Well, there's no saying, no, there's no Tiamat. That's done, right? Their naivety is over. They've had a direct contact with the threat of mortality and social judgment. They've met the terrible mother, and they've met the terrible father. And there's no going back. There's no saying, oh, the world is safe. It's not safe. Not at all. It's not safe. The fact that you think it's safe means that you were living in an unconscious bubble that was sort of provided to you by your culture. It's a gift. And now that's been shattered. And so now what do? Well, the answer is you retreat until you're in your house and there's nowhere you can go. You're the ultimate frozen rabbit, right? And your life is hell because you can't function. The alternative is, let's take apart the things you're afraid of. Let's expose you to them, carefully and programmatically. And then you'll learn that you're actually tougher than you think. You never knew that. And maybe you didn't want to take on the responsibility because, people play a role in their own demise, so to speak. When you had opportunity to go out and explore or withdraw because you were afraid, you chose to withdraw because you were afraid. So it's not only that you were overprotected often, it's that you were willing to take advantage of the fact that you were overprotected and run back there whenever you had the opportunity. So maybe you're a kid in the playground, right, and you're having some trouble with other kids, and in the back of your mind, I should deal with this myself, but you go and tell your mom and get her to intervene. And you know that that's not right. You know that you're breaking the social contract, but it's easier, and so that's what you do. You run off to an authority figure and hide behind the Great Father, roughly speaking. Well, the problem with that is you don't learn how to do it yourself. So then you have to relearn it painfully when you're 40. So then you take people out, you say, well, what are you afraid of? Rank it from 1 to 10. So 10 is, we'll make a list of 10 things you're afraid of. The thing you're least afraid of, we'll call number 10. So we'll start with that. Okay, well, I'm afraid of elevators. Okay, well, let's look at a picture of an elevator. Let's have you imagine being in an elevator. Let's go out to an elevator and let you watch the terrible jaws of death open, because that's how you're responding to it symbolically, right? And you're going to do that at the closest proximity you can manage. You find out, you go do that, it works. You're nervous as hell, especially from an anticipatory perspective. Shaking. You go out, you stop, you watch it happen, and you actually calm down. You do that 10 times and it no longer bothers you. Well, what you've learned that you didn't die, but more importantly than that, you've learned that you could withstand the threat of death. That's what you've learned. And then you move a little closer, and then you move a little closer, and then you move a little closer, and finally you're back in what's no longer the elevator from a symbolic perspective. It's a tomb, right? It's a place of enclosure and isolation. And you learn, turns out I can withstand that. And then you're much more together, much more confident. And that's often one of the things that often happens in situations like that. I've seen this multiple times, is that if you run someone through an exposure training process like that and toughen them up, they'll often start standing up to people around them in a way they never did before, because they wouldn't stand up for themselves before, because they weren't willing to undermine the protection. See, if you're protecting me, I can't bother you, because I can't afford to forsake your protection. So if I'm going to play that game, I'm going to hide behind you, then I can't challenge you. So that's no good, because that's sometimes why people, you see this with guys very frequently, they're still deathly afraid of their father's judgment when they're in their 30s or 40s. It's like, well, why? No, because they still want to believe that there's someone out there that knows. And so they're willing to accept the subjugation, because it doesn't force them to challenge the idea that there's someone out there that knows. Because that's the advantage of having your father as a judge, right? Because he knows. Well, what if he doesn't? What if no one knows any better than you? Well, that's a rough thing. You don't, until you realize that, you're not an adult, right? That's really technically the point of realization of adulthood, is that no one actually knows what you should do more than you do. I mean, it's a horrible realization, because what the hell do you know? It's a terrible realization, and people will often pick slavery, permanent slavery, to the spirit of the Great Father, let's say, over that realization, and it's completely understandable. But the problem with it is that there's more to you than you think, and so if you continue to hide behind that figure, then you never have a chance to understand that there's more to you than you think, far more to you than you think. Maybe there's enough to you so that you can actually withstand the threat of mortality without collapsing, maybe even withstand the threat of malevolence without collapsing. Who knows? It's certainly possible. And it's not an abstract question. It's exactly the sort of question that you address in the psychotherapeutic process. It's always the question that you address. And the answer is often in the affirmative, because people can get unbelievably tough. And you know that because people work in emergency wards in hospitals, right? Or they work in in palliative care wards, or they work as mortuary assistants. I mean, these people have bloody rough jobs, you know, or they're on the front line of police investigation into, you know, heinous child abuse crimes, and so they're confronting malevolence on a regular basis. And, you know, those are very stressful jobs, but people do them. And some people do them without even being damaged by them, although that's a harder thing because you can see horrible things, you know, things you'll never forget. It's funny that philosopher Kierkegaard, you don't usually hear a joke that starts like that, by the way. He wrote 150 years ago, and he was one of the first people who really wrote about anxiety. He was one of the first psychological philosophers. And he regarded himself as rather useless, all things considered. And he wrote a section in one of his books about all the industrialists that were operating in Europe at that time, trying in every possible way to make life easier and easier and more efficient and productive for everyone, which was definitely happening during the Victorian period, and Europe was rapidly transforming into an industrial powerhouse. And he said, someone as useless as him, with an orientation towards being a student who liked to sit and contemplate ideas and talk in cafes and smoke cigars and drink, could never do anything to make anything easier for anyone than everyone was already trying to make it. And so he thought that his task would be to make things more difficult for people, because there would come a time when what people wanted wasn't more ease, but more challenge and more difficulty. And that's really smart, you know, and it's witty and it's true. And one of the things that I've come to understand, I believe, is that, and Dostoevsky knew this too. He wrote about this in Notes from Underground. It's a great book, very short book, brilliant, absolutely brilliant, compelling, dark read. It's the confession of a miserable, resentful, like murderously genocidal bureaucrat who evaluates his own soul, I suppose, and confesses his sins. And it's also a critique of the idea of kind of utopia oriented towards security. And Dostoevsky, who was dealing with the set of ideas that are really tearing us apart culturally right now, this idea of a eventual utopia based on something like security and safety. Dostoevsky really objected to that back in this, like 1860, a long time ago. He said, you know, the thing about people that you don't really understand is that, he said, fundamentally we're ungrateful and we can curse. That's what distinguished us from the animals, which I thought was pretty damn comical. But he said something very interesting, you know. He said, if you set up a utopia so that all people had to do was eat cakes and busy themselves with the continuation of the species, that, yeah, right, Russian humor, you know, that after a surfeit of that, after enough of that, which would happen quite quickly, people would just go mad just to break things, just so something unexpected and remarkable could happen, and that we're not built for security and safety, but for something, well, let's call it adventure, something like adventure. That's a good thing to know, you know, because you don't want to suffer unduly. That seems reasonable. And you might think, because of that, that really what you want is happiness. But then Solzhenitsyn, for example, he wrote about what happened in the Gulag Archipelago under Stalin and said, you know, if your goal is happiness, what are you going to do when the jackboots hammer down your door at 2 a.m. and haul you off to the prison camp, because you're not going to be happy there. And so, you know, happiness is a boat that's easily capsized and the waves are always there. And so if your philosophy is one of, say, impulsive happiness, same sort of thing Dostoevsky was pointing at, and Kierkegaard, then you're not prepared when all hell breaks loose. And all hell, it will absolutely 100% break through at some point in your life. And you're lucky if it won't be decades, you know, it'll certainly be some of it, and it might be a lot of it. And for some of you, it's going to be damn near the whole thing. And so if what floats your boat is happiness, you're you're going to be capsized by the first decent wave. And so then you might ask yourself, you know, what do you have instead of happiness that might be even more reliable? And I do think that adventure is more reliable than happiness. And in the Old Testament story of Abraham, founder of the Abrahamic faiths, and obviously what would you call it, a crucial figure in the development of world culture, Abraham is presented as a late bloomer, to say the least. He's like 83. People lived longer back then, at least so the story goes. And he had a very rich father by nomadic standards, and he could just sit around in the tent all day. And, you know, a doting mother and a rich father, he could just sit around in the tent all day and eat peeled grapes and busy himself with the continuation of the species. And but, you know, God appears to him and says, get away, get out of your security, get out of your comfort, leave your family, leave your community, leave your nation, go out into the world. And it's a very interesting story. It's very interesting to contemplate it from both a psychological and a religious perspective, because what God is presented as in that book, which is a crucial book for as I said, for world culture, is God is presented as the manifestation of the Spirit that calls even the too secure and pampered to adventure. And then Abraham has a pretty rough time when he goes out and has his adventure. It's not all, you know, Skittles and roses from then on in. Quite the contrary. And he runs right away into like a conspiracy of elites to steal his wife. He runs into tyranny, runs into starvation. He encounters war. It's like he goes out in the world and he has the whole tragedy of his life, both on the social and political front and individually, you know. But the promise is the promise of adventure, and the implication is that if you have a sufficient adventure, then that cannot so much protect you from suffering, because perhaps that is impossible, but to justify it. And because you kind of know this in your own life. When you look at your life, you might look back on travails that you've undertaken, you know, and they've done end-of-life surveys with people and asked them what they regret. And, you know, people don't regret what they did that didn't work. They regret what they didn't do that could have worked. You know, they regret the chances they didn't take. And, you know, even if you do an evaluation of your biography, one of the things that you want to be able to say to yourself is something like, maybe there's nothing better you can say to yourself than this. You can think about this for yourself and see if it's true. That was extraordinarily difficult, but it was worth it. And, you know, it's not like you can have one of those without the other, because you can't imagine that you could have some confidence in what you've managed to accomplish, right? The kind of confidence that would instill you with a certain genuine sense of self-regard despite your fundamental inadequacy. To have that fundamental sense of self-regard that's grounded in something real, it has to be based in a narrative that approximates that was extremely difficult, but it was worth it. You have to have both of those. And so that's interesting, because one of the questions we always ask ourselves, this is the theodicy question, technically. You see the suffering in the world, you see the suffering of children, you see maybe your own children or your suffering, and you wonder, well, how can reality be constituted so that I can have faith in its essence when there is so much suffering? And one answer to that is something like, well, how much suffering do you want? And you might think, none. It's like, yeah, I don't think so. I don't think that's right. At least you want something approximating optimized challenge. So you could say, at least you want to be pushed to your limit. And maybe you find the most exciting times in your life. In fact, you'll pay for this. You'll pay to have this experience, to be pushed to your limit, not beyond it, or maybe even a bit beyond it, you know, and maybe not so far beyond it that you crumble and break and things fall apart. But, you know, could you be pushed to your limit optimally if there wasn't the possibility of falling apart and breaking? Like, that's an open question. How are you ever going to take something seriously if the consequences aren't actually serious? You know, and there's something delightful about dancing on the edge. That's why Hawaiians believed that surfing was sacred, you know, and it's because to surf you have to be on the edge, right? And the waves can come and take you out at any moment. But without the possibility of the waves rising to take you out, then you can't dance on the edge. And maybe that's exactly what you want to do, you know. And there's good evidence from the neuroscience literature that consciousness itself is something akin to dancing on the edge. So technically, when you're conscious, when you're awake, your brain is occupying a position between something. It's a position that's something like between chaos and order. And if your brain's maximally ordered, well, you're just bored, nothing is changing. And if you're chaotic, then it's anxiety and catastrophe. But you want to be positioned right between those two, and that's when your consciousness is optimized, you know. And when your consciousness is optimized, then you're deeply engaged in life, and everything seems alive and meaningful. And maybe that's the solution in some profound sense to the problem of suffering. It's that you optimize your interaction with chaos rather than being protected all the time from everything that could hurt you. And you kind of know this too if you have kids, because you don't want to keep your kids in an infantile state, and because when they're infants, pretty much what you do with them, say they're 6 months and younger, is you just keep them secure and safe, right? You just provide everything that you can for them. You have to do that because, well, what are they going to do? They just lay there fundamentally and squawk now and then. I mean, it's not like they're ambulatory. They can't go out and do things for themselves, and so it's up to you, and your goal is to keep them secure and safe. But once they start being able to move around, then increasingly it's sort of up to them. And if you have any sense as a parent, the psychoanalysts used to say, the good mother necessarily fails. And what did they mean by that? They meant, well, you know, if you're committed to your infant when you're a mother for the first 6 months, it's like it's all the kid, 100%, full self-sacrifice devoted towards the infant. That's the right attitude. But even by 9 months, child can crawl around quite a lot. They're developing something of an independent will. You start handing them challenges. You start handing them responsibility, and you keep them on the edge. And some of your kids are going to be able to be pushed harder than others, and part of the reason you have to develop a relationship with your kids, and your husband for that matter, is so that, you know, you can keep them dancing on the edge, on the proper edge. And that's even better than the mere provision of security.
If you're resentful about something, well, first of all, you should notice, I'm resentful. And that's kind of humiliating because no one's proud of being resentful. It's a shameful emotion. Well, so then why are you resentful? Well, there's only two reasons as far as I've been able to tell. One is that you're allowing yourself to be taken advantage of, or you're being taken advantage of. Sometimes you're not allowing yourself. Sometimes you're a child being abused by their uncle. You're not allowing yourself. You can't do anything about it. You're resentful because you're being taken advantage of, or because you're immature. It's one of those two things. Figure out which it is, and then take the steps necessary to address it. Living a life without resentment is a great goal. People are often resentful if they see that responsibility has been abdicated. Why isn't that person doing their job? It's like, well, hey man, step in at your workplace, in your family. You know, and you think, well, I shouldn't have to do that extra work. Well, you shouldn't be a slave. You shouldn't allow yourself to be tyrannized. But if something bugs you because a responsibility is going unfulfilled, there's a great opportunity for you. And this is something I don't think we teach young people well. And one of the things, you may remember this, that was so striking about the tour was that I made a case fairly consistently that most people find the meaning that sustains them through the vicissitudes of life, not in happiness, but in responsibility. And that would bring everyone to a halt. It would always make the whole theater silent. It's like, oh, I never thought of that connection. Because maybe you want to avoid responsibility, and you can understand why. You can understand why. You hide from it. That is what you encounter if you go out in the world and you think, who the hell wants that? I don't want the responsibility. It's like, well, yes, you do, as it turns out. There's nothing better than responsibility. Now, you know, I say that with some caution. I think that it's hard to say. The responsibility, I've been overwhelmed by my apparent responsibility, but I think it's also kept me alive. And I mean that literally. And so,
wait, can you go a little deeper with that? I mean, when you were at your darkest moments in the last 2 years, whatever that might be, Was it the feeling
Well,
of
there's
the...
been many times in the last year where it would have been much easier for me just to be dead. That's constant. So, but no.
But is it but no because of something in you, or is it but no because of the people, that you would have abdicated that responsibility of the people? Or is that ultimately the same
That's
thing?
it.
Yeah.
Well, I do think the two aren't easily distinguishable, but it's definitely that. It's definitely that. You know. And it's one of the chapters, the last chapter, is be grateful in spite of your suffering. You know, you need a meaning to sustain you through suffering. And it is the case that you find that in responsibility. Well, and so it's good advice for anyone who's at work. You're resentful about this and that because people aren't pulling their weight. Pull it. See what happens. You become indispensable instantly. You'll know everything. And maybe that job won't be for you, or maybe that relationship won't be for you, but you'll take your hard acquired wisdom and go elsewhere and flourish there. So, you know, this kid stopped me. I think I wrote about this in this book. Kid stopped me in a restaurant one day when I was walking in, and he said, and he had an undergraduate degree, and he was working as a waiter in a chain steak place. And he stopped me and he said, you know, about 6 months ago, I was watching one of your lectures and I decided to stop being resentful about my job. And he was resentful because he had a university degree and he's working as a waiter. You know, and look, I don't have anything against waiters. It's like a waiter can make your evening, you know, hooray. He said, well, I decided I'd start trying at my job, like really trying as if it was worthwhile. He said he got 3 promotions in 6 months, like he's just rocketing up the power hierarchy. Well, it's not power, it's competence if it's well run. You know, and places are full of opportunity. There's always people out there who are doing far better than you on pretty much anything you want to imagine. And if all you're doing is seeing yourself in their reflected light, let's say, then it's going to be pretty damn dismal. But it's not a good comparison because, well, first of all, there's danger in just comparing yourself to others, period, because they're not you. And God only knows what struggles they had to undertake to get to where they were, or what burdens they're currently carrying that you're not aware of. But you can certainly contrast yourself with yourself. And that's a lot better. It is the only way. Well, it's also the only way of really measuring anything approximating proper improvement. You can actually tell when you're a little better than you were yesterday.
Right.
And you can actually do that. That's another thing that's so interesting about it, is that you can actually make yourself a little better in some way, pretty much. Well, I don't know if it's at every moment, but you can certainly do it every day. Let's say you want to become who you could be in the fullest sense. So let's say you're someone who's going to solve some serious problems. Okay, the first thing you have to do is admit to the seriousness of the problems. That's no joke. And so the first thing is just the terror of the problem itself. And that's enough to paralyze you. And that's the Hydra, that's the Gorgon with the head of snakes. It'll paralyze and turn you to stone. That's the basilisk in the Harry Potter series. Mm-hmm. You look at it and it turns you to stone and lurks underneath everything, right? And it's malevolence and tragedy. And so there's that. And then the next is, well, you're going to take responsibility for that? You're really going to do that, are you? That's a hell of a load, man. And so it's daunting to even consider that. And then there's the discipline and responsibility that necessitates, which is also daunting. It's like, oh my God, the problem's that serious. I'm really going to have to get my act together in order to not contribute to it, much less solve it. And so the problem is terrible. And then the solution is daunting. But the upside of that is like, well, there isn't anything better to have than a problem that's worth solving, like that's really worth solving. Right. And so the more of that you take on, the more you have a reason to get out of bed in the morning, no matter what. Like, I'm getting up, I'm trudging forward. Doesn't matter what I'm suffering from. I've got things that need to be done. They're necessary. And that gives you that sense of purpose that is the antidote to bitterness. Okay, well, let's say you want your life to be meaningful. It's like, okay, then what you do matters. It actually matters. Or how starting to clean up the room changed their life. That's quite fun because it's something I always tell people to do instead of going out and protesting. Jesus, I just can't stand
Cleaning up
that.
the room?
Yeah.
Meaning?
Well, my sense is that if you want to change the world, you start from yourself and work outward because you build your competence that way.
It's like, I don't know how you can go out and protest the structure of the entire economic system if you can't keep your room organized. Well, I made a video call, which was called Message to Millennials, where it was called How to Change the World Properly. A bit of it on the pretentious side, I suppose, but I was trying to produce something that was a counterposition to this idea that what you should do is go out and fix up other people. You know, that's just not right. And there's a New Testament line about that, something about, you know, not worrying too much about the log in your neighbor's eye, or about the speck in your neighbor's eye when you have a log in your eye. What would the world be like if people stopped avoiding the things they knew they should do? You know, because the question is, how much are we contributing to the fact that life is an existential catastrophe and a tragedy? How much is our own corruption contributing to that? That's a really worthwhile question. The things you leave undone because you're angry, you're resentful, you're lazy, you have inertia. Well, you consult your conscience and it says, well, you know, that place over there could use a little work. It's the same as working on yourself, and so you clean that up because you can. And then things are a little clearer around you, and you're a little better off because you've practiced a bit, and so you're a little stronger. And then something else manifests itself and says, well, maybe you could like take a crack at fixing me up too. So you decide to do that, and then that gets a little bit more pristine, you know. And soon, and it's humble because you're not exceeding your domain of competence. You know, it's like, don't be fixing up the economy, 18-year-olds. You don't know anything about the economy. It's a massive, complex machine beyond anyone's understanding, and you mess with it at your peril. So, and can you even clean up your own room? No. Well, you should think about that. You should think about that.
Right? They're all like, why should I stand up, be a martyr, get fired? This guy at Google got fired.
Yeah.
How do you convince people that there's a point to standing up when it appears to be futile?
Well, the first thing I think is you convince them that it's not futile. It might be difficult, but it's not futile. If you get your words right, you have something to say, there'll be an impact of those words. It might not be the impact that you would choose. But the other thing you got to tell people is, pick your poison. You may be in a situation where you don't have a cakewalk to the Garden of Paradise. You got tyranny or famine. Those are your choices. But you get to pick which one you have. And I would say if you're being oppressed, and I mean in your soul, by what you're required to swallow at work, well, you think you're not paying a price for that? You got no self-respect, and rightly so. But worse than that, you're an agent of your own destruction. You're destroying your own ideal, and you're letting people who are weak and corrupt win. And if you stood up and stood up properly, but you have to put yourself in order to do this, at least to some degree, right? You can't do it casually. You have to do it from some position of preparedness and strength. Then what makes you think you couldn't scare them back into the corners? And that would be a good thing. And, you know, the alternative personally is bad because there's a psychological degeneration that goes along with it. I've seen this with many of the people that I've worked with who have been tyrannized in the workplace to the absolute detriment of their psychological and physical health, right? To the point of collapse, confronting these crazy things when they were sensible people. That's a terrible price to pay, man. Like it's a bad price. And then if the foolishness isn't dealt with at the local level, when it's still relatively trivial, then it will multiply until it's dealt with at the social level. And we're seeing signs of that already. Antifa is a good sign of that. You know, and problems that aren't solved multiply, and soon people fight. And you know, better to argue than to fight. Unless you want to fight. And some people want to fight, and I can understand why, but I wouldn't recommend it because that doesn't lead good places. It really doesn't lead good places. So I'd say you have a duty. Maybe that's why you stand up. It's because you have a goddamn duty to stand up and just say what you have to say. You don't even have to be trying to make a point exactly or trying to get something done. It's like, this is how it looks to me. That's what that guy at Google did. He wrote this memo and he said, I talked to him today. He said, well, he went to a diversity training seminar and he thought, no, I don't agree with that. And so then they asked for feedback. So we wrote this document a month ago. This was written a month ago. Got no real response to it. Well, it bounced around inside Google until a lot of people, got interested in it, and then it escaped into the outside world. But all he was doing was, he was told a bunch of things he didn't think were true. He wrote down a bunch of things he thought were probably true. He launched that out and said, well, I think these things are probably true. It's like, well, probably they're true. Well, so he paid a price for it, but maybe we'll see what sort of price he paid for it. Man, he's going to be a lot tougher in 2 years than he was 2 years ago. Like I reviewed this guy's document. I did that yesterday. And everything he said was validated by the scientific literature. So what has happened is that someone has been fired publicly by a major corporation for stating well-grounded scientific truths. Right. They're exactly the sorts of things that I say in my classes, for example. And the reason that I say them is because I read the literature. It's not because I'm personally happy about the facts. I think IQ research particularly is so dismal that you can't possibly read it without being seriously disheartened. If I could reconstruct the world so that the IQ research wasn't true, well, it'd sure be tempting, But that's not how science works. Science doesn't tell you what you want to hear. It just tells you the way it bloody well is. And he got pilloried for revealing a good fraction of current scientific knowledge about gender differences. Okay, that's not good. And as you said, that's a big company and it controls our communication. So how about we do what we can to ensure that these large communication companies don't get to impose a factually false ideological structure on the rest of the planet. Well, you could think about supporting this guy who blew the whistle. There's a fundraiser for him online. He could use some money. He wants to sue Google. Yeah. Maybe we could let them know that hiring a human resources director who's also concerned with equity is probably not a good idea for a capitalist company. Why in the world would you hire your own enemies? I don't understand that. So, well, we'll see how the dialogue continues. But back to the personal, you need to say what you think because that's where you come from, right? And if you don't say what you think, then you kill your unborn self. That's what you do. That's what Cain did when he killed Abel. And that's why his punishment was unbearable. You have things in you that are struggling to come to the light. That's the truth you need to utter. And you need to utter that truth because without that truth, you cannot live in the world. Because the world's real and you need truth to live in the world. And if you stifle your truth, well, how can that be anything but something that brings about hell? How could it be any other way? So you think, well, why should you speak up? That's easy, because the consequences of not speaking up, although delayed, are far worse. That's the reason. That's the reason. If it can't be courage, it could at least be prudence. If you could have what you wanted in this moment, and I could deliver it, what would it be? How much of the mess that you see around you would vanish if the mess that you could put straight was put straight? You know perfectly well that if you put your mind to it and you make the proper sacrifices, there are things you can set straight.
What advice do you have for a young man in his 20s?
Make a plan. Look at what you're interested in. Get disciplined about something. Allow for the possibility that you have something important to contribute to the world, and that the world would be a lesser place without that contribution. Don't be afraid of taking on responsibility. It's where you find what sustains you in your life. You can take on too much responsibility. You have to be cautious in that regard, but that's a less common problem than not taking on enough. A lot of the things that people regard as traps are actually the means to their life. You have to understand that you're not your own servant, so to speak. You're someone that you have to negotiate with, and you're someone that you want to present the opportunity of having a good life too. And that's hard for people because they don't like themselves very much. You have to believe that your action has some redemptive possibility, because why would you do it otherwise? And you might say, well, I kind of believe that. It's like, well, that's not good enough. You know, you kind of got to throw yourself all into it. And what's the cost anyways? It's not like you're going to get out of this alive. So you're pretty much all in whether you want to be or not. And maybe if you were voluntarily all in, things would be a lot better than they are. If the world isn't everything that you want it to be, maybe you're not acting the way you should. One of the things people do to buttress themselves against failure is to never let themselves really gain clarity about what they need and want. Let's say you try something, but you only do it half-heartedly. And then you fail, and you think, well, I didn't really fail because, you know, I held a bunch back in reserve, and so I didn't get what I wanted, but maybe had I been all in, I would have. And so you don't have to upbraid yourself too much for the failure. Now, it's a catastrophic way to live, to sit on the fence and to not commit, because instead of risking the possibility of failure, you engage in what's essentially the absolute certainty of failure. Because if you want something worthwhile and difficult, which you probably do if you want to have an adventure and go somewhere, then what's the chance you're going to get it if you're halfway in? You can't be halfway in, but that sort of protects you against failure, because you can tell yourself, well, if I tried, I could have done it. It's like, you know, you tell yourself that 200 times and your life's over. Better have a valued goal, because otherwise you can't get any positive motivation working out. And so the more valuable the goal, in principle, the more the micro processes associated with that goal start to take on a positive charge. And so what that means is, well, you get up in the morning and you're excited about the day, you're ready to go. And so as far as I can tell, what you do is you specify your long-term ideal, you specify your goal. You do that in some sense as a unique individual. You want to specify goals that make you say, oh, if that could happen as a consequence of my efforts, it would clearly be worthwhile. Would it really be so terrible if my life wasn't miserable? Would it be so terrible if I got what I wanted and needed, especially if I was doing that in the best possible way? Well, there isn't anything better to have than a problem that's worth solving. Like, that's really worth solving, right? And so the more of that you take on, the more you have a reason to get out of bed in the morning, no matter what. Like, I'm getting up, I'm trudging forward. It doesn't matter what I'm suffering from. I've got things that need to be done. They're necessary. And that gives you that sense of purpose that is the antidote to bitterness. So, yeah, there's lots of reasons to, you know, because I've thought for a long time, imagine you have a choice in front of you, because you do. So here's the choice. Your life is either meaningful or meaningless. Okay, so let's go through the meaningless part first. Because you think, well, of course I don't want it to be meaningless. It's like, yeah, just hold on a second. Nothing you do matters. And so impulsive pleasure is the order of the day. No responsibility. You can do whatever you want. It's like Pleasure Island in Pinocchio, right? Or it's like Neverland in Peter Pan. You're still a kid. You can play all the time. Yeah. Impulsive pleasure and no responsibility. That's the reward for meaninglessness. Well, but then the other side is, okay, well, let's say you want your life to be meaningful. It's like, okay, then what you do matters. It actually matters, right? Make a mistake, hurts you, hurts your family, hurts the world in a deeper way than you think. And you have to be awake to that. And then you have to take it on yourself.
What has been your experience with dealing with these men who have these nice guy tendencies, who can't stand up for themselves, who their moms raised them to be this type of anti-man?
Yeah, well, sometimes that can also be temperamental, right? Because if a man happens to be high in agreeableness, this is also true of women. They're much more conflict averse and they're nicer in their temperament. So if you get an agreeable boy, let's say, who also has a doting mother, then you might have that problem. There's other ways of having that problem, but that's one way. Well, when I saw people like that in therapy, they were often resentful and angry and passive aggressive and getting in their own way, often to spite, you know, whoever was doting on them, let's say. And so the first thing I would do is listen to why they were there, and then start to unpack that anger, and then start to work with the individual to figure out how to voice that. You know, you have to separate out what's old history and useless, and what's just narcissism and infantilism from genuine concerns. But if you listen to people, they will sort that out for themselves. That's one of the cool things about being a therapist, is if you listen, that happens more or less by itself. And then as a behavioral psychologist, you know, maybe someone like that would need a raise, but would be afraid to ask their boss. Well, we just practice that. It's like, okay, well, first of all, why should your boss give you a raise? Like, there might be good reasons. He doesn't want to lose you because you're a good worker. Well, are you a good worker? And if you weren't, well, we'd solve that problem. Put yourself in a position where you deserve the raise. Okay, well, now you're too timid or you're too unskilled, because you have to differentiate those two things too, because some people who can't stand up for themselves actually don't know how, whereas others are afraid, and some are both. And so you have to figure out, so some of it's skill training. Well, how do you actually ask your boss for a raise? Well, you tell the truth. That's the best way. You say, look, you know, here's what I'm doing. Here's why it's really useful for you. It looks like I'm somewhat underpaid in this role. That's demotivating me, possibly. I also have other options. I think I need, you know, 15% more, and I'm interested in moving up, and here's what I'll do for you if you do that. And so, you know, think about it. And then if your boss doesn't do that and all that's true, well, then you should be assertive enough to find another job. Or maybe you look for another job before you even ask for the raise. Put your CV together, right? Update it so you're not afraid to look for another job. All this is strategic thinking. That was another thing that was really fun about clinical work. Most of my clients, they doubled or tripled their salaries within 3 or 4 years. Oh, you know, wow. They worked at it. This wasn't nothing. This was major league strategic planning. And that was true for women and men, you know, so, and that's very fun to watch that happen. Think clearly about it, right? And get your act together, you know, and you got to see what's getting in your way. So maybe you're afraid to ask your boss for a raise because if he says no, you'd have to look for a job, and you don't have your resume or CV updated. And the reason you don't have it updated is because you're embarrassed about the lacks in it, and you don't want to face the lacks because then you'd have to see how you didn't get educated properly because you were useless, and you'd have to take steps to rectify that. And like, it's a real mess down there, right? Yeah. The reasons you're not asking. So we'd lay that all out and then say, well, you're embarrassed about your resume. Well, update it and let's take a look at it. Okay, well, here's some holes and they're not good. What could you do to fix those? And then you break it down into small steps, right? Implementable steps. That's very practical. So that's a good thing to know. If you have your sights set on a goal, you'll move towards it if you break the steps down small enough so that even someone as useless as you will do it. And that also requires a fair bit of humility, because what you might find, especially if you're avoiding something, is that the step you are actually willing to take is so small that you're embarrassed to admit it to yourself, so you won't take any steps at all. Well, that's completely counterproductive. And the reason that's not proper thinking, let's say, or productive thinking, is that, well, small steps get bigger real fast. And it doesn't matter where you start. If you're doubling your utility every, few weeks, who cares where you start? It starts to take off real quick. So you don't want to be embarrassed. You don't want to be so embarrassed by where you are that it stops you from becoming who you could be. And that's tough. It can be that's real tough. I'm not making light of that. I see exactly why people avoid, but it's not a good solution. There's so little emphasis in our popular culture, especially with regards to the so-called mainstream media, on discipline and responsibility, that there's a tremendous hunger for anything that pertains to that. And you have a right to be discussing that, I would say, because of your background, which if nothing else, required a tremendous amount of discipline.
Yeah, and I ended up writing a book called Discipline Equals Freedom. And I'm lucky that I wrote it when I did, because if I would have written it 2 years later, everyone would have said, oh, everyone's talking about discipline now. So yeah, discipline, absolutely. Discipline does bring you freedom in life. And that's something that I kind of figured out over time. I didn't
Well,
really...
so what do you mean by that? Like, how did you figure that out? And what do you mean by that? Because they're often, and you know, the classic sort of, what would you call it? Romantic rebel is someone who is free from excessive order, let's say. They see freedom and discipline as antithetical rather than seeing one as a precondition for the other. And so how did you learn that discipline was a precondition for freedom? If I've got the equation, how did that manifest itself in your own life?
So we'll start off by saying this. And look, I was a young kid. I joined the Navy to go in the SEAL teams. I went through SEAL training. I showed up at a SEAL team 1. And when I got there, and as I look back, this is a very powerful thing, even though it's very simple. So I'm 19 years old when I show up at SEAL Team 1. I'm done with the basic SEAL training. And I have a goal in my head, which is this. I want to be a good SEAL. Mm-hmm. That's what I want to do. That's like, I don't know about anything else. This is what I want to do. I want to be a good SEAL. That's what I want. I want to be a good SEAL. Mm-hmm. And so as a 19-year-old with all kinds of energy, and we haven't talked about my childhood yet, but I was kind of like a very rebellious kid. When you talked about seeing a kid that looked like you could have handed him a club or a battle axe and he would have probably been feeling a little bit better, I was like that. I was constantly looking around for a club or a battle axe because that's what I felt like I needed to do. And it was beautiful because I was running around the woods as a young kid playing Army. And I just went and actually played Army. That's what I ended up doing. So I never really had to force myself into some mold that I didn't want to be into. So I got to SEAL Team 1, and now I just want to be a good SEAL. That's what I want. And so now that starts steering some of my decisions. And for the most part, it steered my decisions in a decent direction. Now, there were some times where, as I look back now, what I thought was a good SEAL was a little bit off, but luckily it wasn't 180 degrees off. It might've been off 30 degrees or 40 degrees. Right. And as I got older and more mature and I figured out more about what that ideal should look like to me, and I could keep chasing that ideal, that was good. But even to be a 19-year-old kid with a 70 or 80 degree corridor to move forward in is not a bad thing.
No, it's a gift.
It's a gift. Exactly. Mm-hmm. So then I'm looking around at other SEALs that were older than me and more senior to me and trying to figure out which one of those guys is a good SEAL.
Yeah.
And what I realized was that the guys that were working harder, for the most part, were good SEALs. Now there's just some people that are just way talented.
Right.
And they could show up, 3 minutes before a run or 3 minutes before we do a shooting competition, and they could just walk through it, no problem.
Right.
And that's great for them. It wasn't me. I'm not that great at anything, but I saw other guys that might not be great at anything either, but they worked hard. They showed up to work early. They did the drills that they were supposed to do. They had discipline. Mm-hmm. And when you have
has amalgamated statistics, and I hope I get this right, but it's approximately correct. If you work 10% longer hours, you make 40% more money. Right. And so, and I think your comments about talent are also dead on. It's like in any field of enterprise, there are people who are phenomenally gifted. And then if they work really hard, they're even more phenomenally gifted, right? Those are the people who break records. But that talent apart, hard work actually works. And with virtually everything, it might not make you the best at whatever it is you're pursuing, but it will certainly make you better than you are. And then I have this new book. I hope you got a copy, because did you get a copy? Okay, so I'm bringing it up for a particular reason. I have a chapter in this book called, well, there's two that are relevant. Imagine who you could be and then aim single-mindedly at that. That's one. And then the course, or what would you call it? A complementary chapter is work as hard as you possibly can on one thing and see what happens. And that's also predicated on this idea that discipline is a precondition to freedom. So you were fortunate, like you had this goal, right? So that meant you had a goal, which is a really big deal because you could learn about goals. You had a sense of a higher mode of moral being, that I would rather be a good SEAL than the person I am now. Well, it's a code of behavior and a way of perceiving. So there's an ethic in that. And then you said as well, you know, your conception of what good SEAL meant changed as you matured, but that's also fine. It wouldn't have changed unless you would have pursued that initial only partially accurate goal. And so that's also a really good thing for people to understand is like, if you don't know what you're doing, aim at something. Is it the right thing? No, but it's better than just shooting randomly. So you aim at something, and then as you aim and you move towards it, you're going to find out why you're wrong. And then you might recalibrate your aim. And that's going to happen over and over because as you move towards a goal, it recedes or it broadens or it recedes and broadens. And otherwise you'd run out of things to do.
And it's also very much worth thinking about with regards to setting up your life in general. It's like, if you concentrate solely on your career, you can get a long way in your career. And I would say that that's a strategy that a minority of men preferentially do. That's all they do. They work like 70, 80 hours a week. They go flat out on their career. They're staking everything on the small probability of exceptional status in a narrow domain. But it's hard on them. They don't have a life. It's very difficult for them to have a family. They don't know how to take any leisure activity. Like they get very one-dimensional. Now, it may be that that unidimensionality is the price you have to pay to be exceptional at one thing, right? Because if you're going to be something like a genius level mathematician, and you want to do that for, or a scientist say, it's like you're in your lab all the time, you're working 70 hours a week or 80 hours a week, you're smart, you're dedicated, you're unidimensional, and that's how you get to beat all the other people who are doing that. It's the only way. But the problem is you don't get a life. Now, if you love being a scientist and you have that kind of focus of mind, well, first of all, you're a rare person, and second, you're going to pay for it. But fine, more power to you. But it's a risky business to do that. You sacrifice a lot for it, you know. And I would say most often, if you're speaking about having a healthy life, that isn't what you do. You spread yourself out more. So you know, you have a family, you have some things that you do outside of work that are meaningful to you and useful. You have a network of friends. Well, those 3 things alone, or 4 things alone, are plenty to keep you well oriented. And then if one of those things collapses, you know, everything doesn't go. Now, the price you pay for that is the more you strive to optimize that balance, the less likely you are to be fantastically successful at any single one of them. But you might have a very, you know, if you consider your life as a whole, that might be a winning strategy. One of the things Carl Jung said, I really liked this. He thought that men went after perfection and women went after wholeness. So they're different value, they're different, there's something different at the top of the value hierarchy. So perfection would be stake it all on one thing and look for radical success. Not that all men do that, because they don't, but we're talking about extremes, at least with regards to the men that do that. The wholeness idea is more like, well, it's like I want one thing in my life to be 150%, or I want 5 things in my life to be 80%. Well, there's a lot more richness in a life where you have 5 things operating at 80%, but you're not operating at any of them at 150%. So, and I really believe this because I've watched men and women go through their careers now for a long period of time, and one of the things that, there's lots of things that produce this, but one of the things that I've noticed is that mostly women in their 30s bail out of unidimensional careers. They won't do them. They won't put in the 80 hours a week that they would have to put in order to dominate that particular area. And it isn't, the reason that they won't do it is because they decide it's not worth it. And no wonder, because why would that be worth it? You have to ask yourself that. It's like, well, you want to be an outstanding scientist. It's like, okay, really, that's what you want, because that means that's what you do. Because you're competing with other people, you know, they're smart, they're hardworking, and if you want to be at the top, you have to be smarter and work harder than any of them. And working hard means working long hours. I mean, it also means working diligently, but in the final analysis, it's also an additive issue. If I'm smart and hardworking and I can crank out for 70 hours a week, and you do it for 30, it's like, in 2 years, I'm so far ahead of you, you will never, ever catch up. So, anyways. And I think partly, maybe part of the reason too that women are oriented that way more than men, I think there's two reasons. One is socioeconomic status does not make women more attractive on the mating market, but it does make men more attractive. And the second is women's time frame is compressed, right? Because guys can always say, well, I'll have kids later, and they can say that till they're like 80. Whereas women, it's like, no way, man, you got to get it together by the time you're, let's say 40, but really probably by 35, but definitely by 40, because otherwise it ain't happening. And that's bloody dreadful. Like, the most unhappy people you ever see, no. No. One of the common routes to extreme unhappiness is to want children and not have them. I wouldn't recommend that. You know, you see couples who are in their 30s. 1 couple in 3 over the age of 30 has fertility problems. That's defined as inability to conceive after 1 year of trying. 1 in 3. So it's worth thinking about, because people are very, very unhappy if they want to have kids and then they can't. Man, you're in the medical mill for 10 years if that's what happens to you. And so this is a good thing for people to know. If something bothers you, there's a billion things that could bother you, and not everything does. And so then you might ask, well, why does that thing bother you when some other thing that's equally bad doesn't? And as far as I can tell, the answer to that is because if it bothers you, that's your problem. And you might think, I don't want to have a problem. It's like, that's because you don't know that problems and opportunities are the same thing. So if a problem's crying out to you, then it could well be that your proper destiny is to address that problem, in which case it's an immense opportunity. And you saw that, exactly that. Oh, look, there's an absence in the marketplace. Well, that's a good discovery, an absence in the marketplace, especially if you're right. And so that's what you did, and then you got a movie out of it. So that's a pretty good deal.
Yeah.
You know, and that's independent of its eventual success as a movie, because even if it lands at any of the levels of success it could land at, you got to make a movie. And so that's pretty good. And God only knows what you learn doing that. So there's no loss in that, right?
Yeah.
There's just gain.
There was an interesting thing that I realized during this whole thing, and it is related to what you just said. So for many years, I have told people that if you have an idea and you don't execute on it, your idea doesn't mean anything. Ideas are a dime a dozen, and it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
And what I realized in making this movie is that I was actually wrong.
Okay.
Because if an idea, it's worthless if you don't execute it on it. I get that. But the actual idea, that if you have an idea, if you have an idea and it's good,
Yeah.
you can't even put a price tag on that thing. And that's why when you look at Hollywood makes a bunch of what are they called? Like reruns of the same movies, right? Yeah. There's a reason for that. They have all this money to throw at ideas, and they just go, well, you know what? Make the superhero movie again, make the space movie again. They just make the same movies often over and over again. And I realized that these, if you have a really good idea, you have to execute on it. You have to do something with it, because if you don't, it's like a mortal sin not to execute on a good idea.
Well, it's a revelation, a good idea. Yeah. It's a gift. It's grace.
Where does it come from? That's why I was kind of very curious.
That's exactly right. Because I know the answer to that.
I look at it like, they know what molecules are in an amoeba, right?
Yeah.
We know what chemicals and we know what's in it, but we can't make an amoeba. We can't make something alive. And just like in a movie or a book or a song, They know, you go to Nashville, they know what notes make a hit song, but they can't just produce a hit song. They can put all the chemicals in there, but they can't bring it to life. And so there is, just like there's something special about life, there's a spark that we don't understand. We can't fabricate it. We cannot fabricate that spark in life. And we can't, as far as I can tell, we can't fabricate that spark of an idea.
Okay, so there's a bunch of things that come off that. So one of the things I realized, so I've done a lot of lecturing again this year. I don't know how many different cities we went to, 60 or 70, over the last 8 months, maybe more than that, a lot. And I have a chance to develop my ideas every night. One of the things I came to understand more clearly was, this is a very cool thing, and it's relevant to what you just said, is that the spirit of your aim, you could say, answers your prayers or informs your thoughts. And it has to be that way because thought is a navigation tool, right? You set an aim and then your perceptions line up so you can see your way forward, but your thoughts and your emotions also aid that because you want to get there, let's say. And then the methods by which you might advance come to mind because you've set your aim. Okay, so we can take this apart in this idea that came to you. It's like you wanted to serve your children, okay? You wanted to serve them in a manner that was better than what was being served to them. You wanted to serve them in a manner that would help them develop in this adventurous way. So that was your goal, your aim, when you went to the library. And then what happened was there was a mismatch between what you discovered and your aim. And so now that constitutes a problem, but it also constitutes an opportunity, right? Because now you see that if your aim was correct and there's a void, well, then that's a moral problem even. Okay, so now if it's a moral problem because your aim was right and the mechanisms for that aim to be manifested aren't available, well, then that's a genuine gap and it needs to be addressed. And if you figure that out, it's your moral responsibility to do something about it. But it's also your great opportunity. Okay, so there's that. So that's what you're serving. If your aim is correct and true, and you have a revelation in relationship to that aim, and you don't act on it, you've thrown away the pathway to that aim, and you've betrayed it. That's not a good idea. But even more concretely, one of the things my wife has really learned to do in the last 2 years, she started to write and she started to speak publicly because she introduces me and talks for about 10 minutes. And she's learned during our discussions, our private discussions, let's say, if an idea emerges, she writes it down right away, no matter what we're doing, right? The idea comes, you write that thing down because it's a gift and God only knows what it's worth. You could have a good idea now and then. It might be a good idea that changes your whole life. And you could have that idea and be casual enough to forget it. And that was that. And then you'd wonder why you never got anywhere. It's like, well, you had a gift and you didn't. And then there's another issue too, is the things that meet with reward grow. That's a neurological truth. That's how large language models are trained. They're trained with reinforcement. The closer they get to the target, the more weight is put on that response. So it's literally reward that trains large language models to match to target. Well, if you have a bit of a creative spark and and ideas are being revealed to you in concordance with your aim, and then you don't act on those, you punish them. You punish the source of the ideas. Just like demoralizing a kid. Like if a kid comes to you with ideas and every time they come, you say, oh, that's stupid, or what the hell do you know? Or you say, I'm going to do something about that, and then you don't. That kid will stop coming to you with ideas. And people do that to themselves all the time. Yep. And so you even have an obligation to you can watch this, This is what I've been trying to teach people too, is if you want to improve your life, it's like, well, set that as an aim. I'd like things to be better. And then ask, what could I actually do that would move me somewhat in that direction? You'll get an answer. That's a good way to pray. That's a good way to pray.
And I've experienced two things here, and these are like the opposite ends of the spectrum. And this is, I think, a very positive thing for people to hear. If I was a young person, I would really like to hear this. So there are going to be times like you're talking about with your wife where all of a sudden from nowhere, or from somewhere, but somewhere that we don't know and understand. All of a sudden, there's an idea there.
The source of all revelation.
It shows up.
Yeah.
It shows up. I've had that happen to me, where it's like, boom, I wrote a book called Mikey and the Dragons. That came just boom. I just instantly had this idea. Boom, I wrote the book.
Yeah.
And I remember when I was an English major in college, and some of the old poets, they would claim that, you know, they just wrote this first, you know, the first draft, that was it. It was one draft, one shot. And there was sort of rumors about these that's not really happened. They found their notes. They'd written a bunch of drafts. But sometimes it's true. Sometimes you will get that inspiration, it'll come and boom, you're done.
Yeah.
So you can sit around and wait for that. I don't recommend waiting for that, though. It may or may not come.
Yeah.
We can't control that. The other side of the spectrum, which I've also had this happen to me, and my silly term that I came up with for it is squeezing your brain. You have to like squeeze your brain and squeeze something out of it. And what I like is this idea, just to come full circle a little bit here. You know, I had this thing where I wanted to have lessons for my kids that they could read in a book.
Yeah.
And so I have that. There's my aim, what you would call an aim.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't immediately say, oh, okay, what I can have as a kid that's going through kind of kid problems, and his uncle, who's a Navy SEAL, can come and stay with him for the summer and he can teach him. I didn't have that. And I definitely didn't have the nuances of like, oh, he can get bullied by this kid. And he can times
that
like,
fills in.
Right. But I squeezed on my brain and thought, what would be a good, and then all of a sudden, boom, you just start, you find your path and the story will come or the idea will come. And
well, that's part of that disciplined striving. Like I learned when I first started writing, I forced myself to sit and write every day. And some days I was highly productive and other days I wasn't so productive, but every day if I sat long enough, I was a little bit productive. And then I got better at being productive and much better at not delaying sitting down. That took a long time, really years to really get disciplined. I'm still learning that discipline, right? I mean,
how long do you write for at a time?
I max out about 3 hours. Okay. I find that if I write more than 3 hours continually, I get exhausted. So 3 hours is about right. And I've learned tricks like at the end of the writing session, write down what you're thinking so you can use that the next day and do it every day and so on. And I've got to the point now where I can write a newspaper article, a good newspaper article, pretty much in one draft, but that's taken 35 years of writing to manage that. But I learned early that if I sat long enough, I would write something that would be valuable, right? And some days it took like 45 minutes to get warmed up so that, you know, everything I wrote was just painful to produce and not of very high quality. But if you persist, the thing that persistence, that's the other thing that's kind of interesting neurologically. You know, I already said if you punish the source within you that gives rise to ideas, it will stop producing ideas. So that's a bad idea. But it's also the case that you want to make being creative the victor over all the competing pulls and temptations. And partly what you're doing when you're disciplining yourself is that. It's like, no, I'm going to sit here, regardless of all the other things I could be doing, all the other things I could be thinking, until that part of me that's able to create wins that internal battle and prevails. And then it gets stronger and stronger over time. And that's building character. That's exactly what that is.
I called the course Personality and Its Transformations, and I think you could think about that as a restatement of the idea of being and becoming. And that's what you are. You're, for whatever that means, you're an entity that both is and is transforming. And there's a rule that goes along with that, by the way, which is don't sacrifice who you could be for who you are, which means if you have to choose to transform in a positive direction or maintain your current position, then it's better to transform in a positive direction. So you might even think of that as the core of your being. That's a Piagetian idea. It's a Jungian idea as well. Who are you? You're the thing that transforms who you are. Now, you're also who you are, but on top of that, you're the thing that transforms who you are. And I do think that that's not an arbitrary statement. You know, one of the things that modern universities do dreadfully now is convince their students that value structures are relative, and that's a big mistake. there's a lot of things wrong with that idea, and one of the things that's wrong with that idea is that doesn't include what I just mentioned, which is that's a good moral rule, is you are the thing that is and you're the thing that becomes, and you should put the thing that becomes at a higher place than the thing that is. That means you also have to allow yourself to shake off those things about you that you might be pathologically attached to, habits and people for that matter, ways of thinking, all of those things. You have to allow yourself to shake those off, and that's more like a burning. That's why the phoenix is the symbol that it is, right? It's old and it deteriorates, it bursts into flame, and then it's reborn. It's like, well, do you want to be reborn? It's like, well, that's not the question. The question is, do you want to burst into flame? And the answer to that generally is no, but that's the wrong answer. The right answer is you let all that nonsense burn away. And you know, and you might say, well, I don't know what I should leave behind, and the answer to that is that's a lie. You know some of the things that you should leave behind. All you have to do is ask yourself. You'll come up with a list instantly of 100 stupid things that you're doing that you know you could stop doing. Some of them maybe you don't know you could stop doing. It's like, well, fine, leave those alone for now. But there's a bunch of things you perfectly know well that you could stop doing that would improve your life. And so do that, see what happens. That's a good idea. All right. So it's personality and its transformations, because partly I wanted to talk to you about what you are as a human being and also as an individual, but also what you could become. And that's actually a crucial question in the domains of clinical psychology in particular, because a lot of what you're doing with people as a clinician is trying to figure out who they could become. That's right. You have a problem, your life isn't what it could be. It's like, fine, let's see what it could be like if we changed it. We'll figure out how to change it. That's got to be a negotiated dialogue, right? Because like, I don't know what the hell you should do with your life. I can help you figure it out, maybe we can talk about it, but you are the person who has to decide if the things that you're aiming for, you know, get you out of bed in the morning, because that's at least one of the crucial issues. So you got to specify the goal, and then you got to specify the transformation processes and start practicing them. And you have to understand that you're going to be bad at it, but it doesn't matter, because bad's fine. Persistent is what you need to be. If you persist with tiny improvements, if you persist, you win. So okay, so in a broader context, you can think about this as a more fundamental ontological question. So one question is how you should act in the world. The other question is, well, what is the world? And that's a complicated problem. This is a scientific answer to that question, and that is that the world is a collection of objective phenomena, and that's a very powerful perspective. And we have a good method for determining what the world is like as a collection of objective phenomena. And that's made us very technologically powerful, and so more power to us and all that, but leaves a question unanswered. And the question is, well, the world isn't just a place of objective phenomena, because it's not a panoply of inert matter. It has living conscious creatures in it, and they're a different order of being. And the fundamental issue for conscious active creatures is not what is the world from an objective perspective, but how it is that you should conduct yourself in the world. And there's a kind of unbridgeable gap between those two domains of inquiry. And I think the reason for that is that the scientific method removes value from its descriptions. That's actually what it does. And so once you're left with value-free descriptions, it's very difficult to extract out a value proposition from them, because that's the scientific method removes the value propositions. You're supposed to be left with only that which is objective, right? And the value propositions are in the domain of the subjective. So I think the idea that you can derive what you should be or do from a collection of facts is flawed, A, because collecting the facts themselves gets rid of the value structure, but B, there's an infinite number of facts, and so how are you going to pick which ones should guide you? You can't. You have to do something else. The facts do not tell you what to do with the facts. You need something else to help you figure that out. Well, it's come to me over the years that that's what the narrative cognitive framework does. It's the framework that we use to specify how we should act in the world. And so you could divide the world into the world as it is and the world as perhaps it should be. That gives you some direction, and you need that, and we know this technically, right? You need direction. The reason for that is it's direction that produces primary positive emotion. And so if you need positive emotion to move through life, which you do, because you can't even move without positive emotion, and also positive emotion is a good bulwark against terror and pain. If you need those things, then you need direction, you need a goal, you need a value structure. So that doesn't seem particularly disputable to me. You could still say, well, what value structure? It's like, okay, fine, that's a good question. But I was, you know, I've thought a lot about that too. So if we're going to adopt a value structure, there's a couple of rules that go along with it. And this is why the bloody postmodernists are wrong, as far as I can tell, is A, it can't just be my value structure, because I'm stuck with you. And we're both stuck with all these other people. And so if I'm going to lay out a value structure, which is a way of interpreting the world, let's say, and there's an infinite number of potential ways of interpreting the world, it's like, yeah, fine, no problem, except that I have to interpret the world in a way that I can use while I'm dealing with you, and while the two of us are dealing with everyone else, and while all of you are dealing with everyone else. And so that's the Piagetian game proposition. If you want to be a popular kid on the playground, you better play games that other people want to play. That's a brilliant, brilliant, brilliant observation. And I told you that Piaget was trying to heal the rift between science and religion, and that's one of the things that he did that he thought helped do that. The question is, well, where do moral judgments come from? Well, they emerge as a consequence of consensus, and it's a bounded domain. If we're gonna occupy the same space for any length of time, and those are two critical propositions, the same space and a long time, then we have to figure out how to play an iterative game that doesn't spiral downward, hopefully that might even improve, that we both don't object to, because otherwise it's not going to work, right? You'll walk away and play another game, or the game will disintegrate catastrophically. So there's massive social constraint on what constitutes an appropriate frame of reference. So much for the relativist argument. And then there's another issue that's equally relevant, and it's associated with the idea of objective reality to some degree. But that's not exactly correct, because it's not exactly objective reality. Let's say that you and I decide to occupy the same place for some substantial amount of time, and we figured out how to solve the problem of being together. But you and I still have to figure out how to solve the problem of being together in a manner that doesn't make the world object too much. And it isn't just other people, although that's a huge part of the world. You want them to not object. You may even want them to support you. That would even be better. But you also have to deal with the tendency of matter to object. Because so your mode of being in the world, your interpretive framework, as a description of how you should act, is actually the laying out of a strategy that will produce the ends that it predicts, which are the things that you want. So this is the pragmatist perspective. This was worked out by William James and his people back in the late 1800s in New England, the only genuine brand of American philosophy. And what the pragmatist said is, how do you decide if something's true? The answer is, how the hell can you? You don't know anything. Well, that's true, but that isn't helpful, because there you're stuck with the problem of how to be in the world. Well, so what you do is you lay out a mode of interpretation that has an endpoint. And then you run the mode of interpretation, embodied, right, because you act it out. And if it doesn't produce the outcome, then it's not, well, let's say, true. The claims within it they're not true by the definition of the game itself. So you might say, well, you're a kid on a playground. You want to play a game. One of the implicit demands is that the game is fun. If it's not fun, it's not worth playing. So you play it for a while, and then you see, well, was that fun? If the answer is yes, then you keep playing the game. You say, well, that game it's good enough, it's accurate enough, it's true enough. And so you lay out interpretations in the world, and they're subject to massive constraints. Other people have to go along with them and cooperate with you, because if they don't, then look the hell out, like it's a major, serious, non-trivial constraint. And then the other thing is, well, social proof isn't good enough. It also has to work in the world outside of the social world. You know, so if you have an illness and you have some hypothesis about how to construe it, you might say, well, is my understanding of the illness correct? Well, it implies that I take these actions. Well, how do you know if it's correct? Well, you take the actions, and if the illness gets worse, then by the definitions that are implicit in the framework of reference that you're using, you've made an error. And so there's no relativism in that. You could still say, well, there's a lot of potential solutions to any potential set of problems. It's like, yeah, there's lots of different ways to play chess on a single board. Right, but that doesn't mean that any old solution is as good as any other solution. It doesn't mean that at all. So, okay, so then we're looking at things two ways. We're trying to figure out, well, how does the world present itself, and then how is it that you should act in it? And so, well, there's other constraints on the mechanisms of interpretation that you place in the world. So we could say, well, you're constrained in your interpretations by the constraints that other people place on you. But there's internal constraints as well. We talked about those mostly from a biological perspective, because you could also regard yourself in some sense as a loose internal society. And that's sort of a psychoanalytic dictum, right? You're a collection of sub-personalities, or you could say you're a collection of sub-routines. I don't care how you formulate it, but you're a unity, but you're a unity that brings together a plurality of subcomponents. And part of the constraints on how it is that you lay out your interpretation of the world is that you have to satisfy those internal subsystems, right? So you're the ego, but it's more like you're the captain of a ship full of people who are rowing. You got to keep the people rowing. You're not tyrant. You're not omnipotent tyrant of your own destiny. You're constrained by the nature of your own being. And so you have to provide yourself with food, and you have to provide yourself with shelter, and you have to provide yourself with water, and all of these things. And those are demands that are laid on you by the nature of your internal processes. And of course, how they lay themselves out as demands and what the appropriate solutions to that is, to those problems are, is debatable infinitely. But you can see the constraints stack up. You have to satisfy your internal constraints. So they have to be brought into a unity. That seems to happen, at least in part, between the ages of 2 and something like between the ages of birth and 4 years old, maybe even 2 years old. You bring yourself together into something that's sort of functioning as a unity. Then you have to turn that unity into a unity that can function in the social world with increasing breadth. And that unity in the social world has to be a unity that can function inside the natural world. It's something like that. So you're stacking up these games into a hierarchy of increasing complexity. And one of the questions that emerges from that is, well, what should be at the top of the hierarchy? If it's a hierarchical structure, it has to be a hierarchical structure because some things have to be worth doing more than others, or you can't act, which is another thing I really don't like about the postmodernist ethos, because it claims that value structures are there to eliminate, to exclude and oppress, and never once notices that, well, yeah, fair enough, but value structures are also there so that you know which way to walk, because you can't figure out which way to walk without saying that that direction is preferable to that direction. So you're stuck with the damn things. And they do exclude. Obviously, category structures exclude. The question is, if you're going to have a value structure, how is it that it should be constituted? Well, I already described some of the constraints. Like if your value structure is perfectly functioning except that you don't get enough to eat, that turns out actually to be a fatal problem, right? And it might be, you can run into all sorts of fatal problems. You're too lonesome. Well, it means let's say that your value structure is too narcissistic. There's lots of reasons to be lonesome, but that might be one of them. Or you're too timid or something like that. Like you're going to be informed by your own internal biological mechanisms when the value structure that you're laying out in the world is insufficient to keep itself propagating across time. And some of that's just you, and some of that's other people, and some of that's the natural world. Constraints galore. And so in the face of all those constraints, it's absolutely unreasonable to say any old solution goes. Just try it. Generate a random solution. Run it as a simulation in the world. And see how many slings and arrows come your way. There'll be plenty. And you might say, well, I don't care about slings and arrows. It's like, yeah, no. That's a claim you don't get to make. So, okay, so you're being informed internally as to the nature of your value structure. You have to specify where you are. You have to specify where you're going. You have to integrate all your underlying biological mechanisms into that schema. It's something I think that's actually kind of weak about the Piagetian ideas, because Piaget, I'm a great fan of Piaget, but Piaget tended to think that the child came into the world with nothing but a set of reflexes. I mean, that's his technical claim, and that you bootstrap off those reflexes, and I think it underestimates the degree to which the child comes into the world as an already prepared unit. And I mean, he just thought of those things as so self-evident that you don't need to talk about them, but that's actually not true. You do need to talk about them. We know, for example, that if you provide children with food and shelter, and adequate food and shelter, but you don't interact with them socially, almost all of them die in the first year, right? It's not optional. Touch is not optional for children. Attention is not optional for children. Play is not optional for children. So it isn't just like, well, the child comes into the world with a set of reflexes and can adapt to any old environment. It's like, no, the environment has to be structured in a certain way or the child will die. And it's very interesting when it comes to things like play and touch, because you wouldn't think of those as fundamental necessities, right? But it turns out that they are. If you deprive a child badly enough of play and touch in the first 3 years of their life, even if they survive, what comes out at the end of that is often something that's like barely recognizable as a functional human being and cannot be repaired after that point. And that experiment was done with Romanian orphans back in the 90s. So it was an ugly situation, to say the least. Okay, so now you take these underlying biological systems and maybe they aggregate themselves into something that vaguely looks like your temperament, your 5 temperamental dimensions. So maybe if you're an extrovert, you're dominated by the dopaminergic system, just like you are if you're high in openness. And if you're high in neuroticism, it's mostly that you're dominated by anxiety systems and systems that mediate emotional pain. And if you're agreeable, you're dominated by the function of the underlying maternal/care affiliation systems. But so you could say, well, you've got these you've got a multitude of fundamental biological predispositions that manifest themselves as implicit stories, something like that, and they organize themselves into the primary temperaments, and the primary temperaments are biasing factors that determine in part the nature of the interpretive structure that you're going to lay out in the world. It's not entirely determined by your temperament. We know that personality is only predicting, something like, let's say, 10% of the variance in most complex social outcomes. And the other elements are, well, temperamental as you might be, you still have to get along with other people and the world. So you come in with these internal biases, but they still have to be modified extensively by your social and your natural surround. Okay, and then you develop your routines from the bottom up, as Piaget pointed out, and sometimes from the top down, because now and then you can think yourself into a radical transformation. But mostly what you're doing is building the micro units of your interpretive schemas and your behaviors and aggregating them into higher order structures that you can then tag with higher order abstractions. And we talked about that. You can't tell a 3-year-old to clean up his room. And the reason for that is those are empty boxes as far as the kid's concerned. Clean? He might have room, he might have that. Clean he doesn't have. He might have pick up the teddy bear and put it in that space, right? So that's one of these little micro routines. And maybe you say, you put 20 of those micro routines together and now you can say, clean up your room. And basically what you're saying is, implement the 10 micro routines that you've learned. And so a well-functioning personality has all the micro routines in place. That's actually something that you help people with if you're a behavioral therapist, because one of the things you assume if you're a behavioral therapist is that sometimes the reason people aren't doing things is because they don't know how. Sometimes maybe the person's depressed but potentially high functioning. They got all the damn micro routines. They're well socialized. They're just dormant. You got to get them awake again and implementing them. But sometimes you get someone in your practice, say, who's just been neglected like you cannot believe, right? The parents never paid any attention to them, or maybe just punished them every time they did something good. That's really fun. And then, they didn't make friends, and so they're really, really vague and poorly articulated. And so then what you do is you work at the bottom of the micro routines and get them to practice building up all these little attributes that they didn't build up. And one of the things you can think about in terms of character development is, so now maybe you understand something about your own personality. You might say, well, what could you do to improve your personality? And the answer is, develop some of the micro routines on the other side of the personality distribution. So if you're disagreeable as hell, maybe you could start learning how to do nice things for people. And that actually works, by the way. So if you take disagreeable people who are depressed and you get them doing nice things for other people, their depression tends to lift. But then by the same token, if you're agreeable, then you should practice doing some things for yourself and being more tough-minded in your negotiations. And so you can sort of place yourself on the personality trait distribution. You're extroverted. It's like, okay, man, learn to spend some time with yourself, right? You're low in openness. Well, try reading a book that's outside of your sphere of interest now and then. If you're conscientious, well, you should probably learn how to relax occasionally, and so forth. So I think partly what you're doing as you're developing your personality is not moving the mean much, the average, where you're located, but you're extending the standard deviation so that you're a bigger bag of tricks than you were before. And I think you can practice that consciously. It's like, you're hyper orderly. It's, well, get a dog. you know. Dogs are messy, horrible things, you know. It's just what you need if you're hyper-orderly, because they're going to leave hair everywhere and force you to live with it. If you were properly oriented in life, if your spirit was in order, you'd aim at the highest thing that you could possibly imagine, and that would point you in the proper direction, and then you would attempt to treat everyone as if they had, including yourself, as if they had a value that was equivalent and related to that high order goal. And that's right. Like, why would you aim at anything other than the highest good you could imagine? It's like, why bother? Almost by definition. If you're going to aim, you might as well aim at what's good. If you're going to aim at what's good, you might as well aim at what's best. And maybe if you aimed at what was best and you managed to progress towards that, it would even be better if you could take everybody along for the ride. And even if you're too cynical and bitter and faithless and nihilistic to think that's a good idea, you can at least see the logic in it and the utility in it, the beauty in it. I'll give you another example. In the story of Exodus, there's a scene before Moses is called on by God to act as a leader of his people. And it's very interesting because the story lays out how you become a leader, like an actual leader, not a tyrant, not someone who's manipulating, not someone who's out for himself, but an actual leader. And that's a very difficult thing to get right. So in this scene, Moses is out walking along a path and minding his own business, and something sort of glimmers and gleams and glistens in the periphery of his vision, and he takes the time to deviate from his path and to investigate it. Now that's worth thinking about, because it means something like this, you know, you're going about your business, and something captures your attention, something captures your interest. And that's an interesting way of thinking about it too. Something captures your interest. And that's sort of how what's interesting makes itself manifest. You can't exactly choose what you're interested in. It sort of chooses you. And then you can decide whether or not you're going to pursue it or not, or ignore it, and you can decide how seriously you're going to pursue it. But you know perfectly well, you know this from being in school, even if you know you should study for a test, if you're not interested in the subject, it's virtually impossible. You can beat yourself with a stick and you can force yourself to do it, but you're going to fight yourself, and you're probably not going to do that great a job. Depends to some degree on your discipline. Whereas if you're interested in it, it captures your attention, and then you pursue it, it's no problem. You enjoy it, like it engrosses you, and it's much easier to learn and to remember. And that's a real mystery, right? I mean, that's the sort of mystery that if you think about with any degree of seriousness, shows you how the world is constructed in a manner that's unlike what you might think. That things call to you. People often wonder how they should decide what to do with their life. And one answer to that is, well, you should see what interests you. You should pay attention to that. And there's kind of two parts to that, because things that interest you, they come in two flavors. One is positive. You're interested and engrossed. There's something you love, some opportunity that beckons, some doors that open, and you can see them, and you're eager and enthusiastic to move in that direction. And you find yourself compelled and motivated and enjoying what you're doing. And then there's problems that interest you, and that's more negative. You'll have something that's bothering you, obsessing you, that you can't get rid of, some problem that is paramount. It might be personal, it might be conceptual, it might be political. It's the axe you're inclined to grind. And it's kind of arbitrary too, because there's a million things in the world you could be worried about that could bother you, that could make themselves manifest as problems, but there's a small subset that are apparently your problem. And people will ask you, your wife will ask you, what's your problem? And that's a good question. What is your problem? And you might think, well, I don't want to have any problems. It's like, well, good luck with that, first of all. And second, it's not so obvious that you'd rather not have any problems because, well, then what would you do? And that's an interesting way to think about your problems, is that if they're your problems, maybe what you have to do is solve them. And you might think, well, I don't know how. It's like, yeah, if you knew how, it wouldn't be a problem. Right, so you have to sort yourself out to solve the problem. You'd have to learn way more than you know to solve the problem. You'd have to become way more than you are to be the person who could address that problem. But then you could see if addressing the problem calls you to be the person that you could be, well, then the problem is an opportunity too. And so then you might think, well, destiny calls to you in the form of opportunities that beckon and problems that compel. And you could take those problems on as your obligation and responsibility, and you could pursue your interests with some degree of seriousness, and who the hell knows where you'd end up. Well, the Exodus story tells you. Moses goes off the path to pay attention to this phenomenon that captures his interest. Phenomenon, the word is from a Greek word, phanesthai, which means to shine forth. And things do that in the world all the time. They capture your attention. That's what happens when you fall in love. Something shines forth. You don't choose that. It happens to you, weirdly enough. What happens to you? Well, who knows? And who knows what's behind it? It's not random. That doesn't mean it's comprehensible. So Moses goes and checks out this phenomenon, and he approaches it, and as he gets closer, he can see that it's a living form. It's a bush. It's a tree. It's on fire, and that's a strange paradox, right? Because obviously, a tree that's on fire would burn into ashes, and trees don't just stand there and burn. Although actually they do, because living things are on fire. They oxidize and they transform, and everything living is like that. So everything living is a combination of being and becoming. And that's particularly obvious in the case of living things, but it's true for everything because nothing is static in its form. It is what it is, and it is what it's going to be at the same time. And the burning bush is being and transformation at the same time. And fire is something that's intrinsically attractive to human beings. Like, we're definitely the descendants of the first ape who couldn't keep his bloody hands off fire, and then mastered it. And you know, you can sit around a campfire and look at it forever. It's one of those things that grips your interest intrinsically. You never get bored by it. It's just endlessly fascinating. It's partly because it transforms constantly, like music, you know. Music and fire share that in common, and not accidentally. And so a burning bush, it's a compelling, it's paradoxical too. It's static, because it still has this tree-like form, and that tree-like form is sort of emblematic of life, and it's burning. And so Moses is very focused on this, and he approaches it more and more closely, and a voice appears, speaks out of the bush and says, "Stop, you're beginning to tread on holy ground." Well, when Tammy talked, she said, well, in essence, she said, what would happen if you listened seriously? And the answer is, well, the more seriously you listened, the more the person you're listening to would reveal themselves, and they'd reveal themselves more and more deeply. And that would be true whether you're listening to your wife or your husband or your friend or whoever you're listening to, because people will tell you everything, including all sorts of things you don't want to know, if you listen. And so you might come to understand that if people aren't telling you, then you're not listening. And if the people around you aren't that interesting, it's because you're not listening. If you were listening, they'd be so interesting you wouldn't even want to be anywhere near them. The people are no shortage of interesting, because people are crazy and strange and demented and peculiar, and they're full of twists and tangles and snakes. And if they tell you what they're really up to, man, it's interesting.
not everybody is equipped to or interested in engaging in high-level discussion of abstract and creative ideas. You hear this idea that everyone's creative. That's a lie. It's as straightforward as that. True creativity is very, very rare. And if you happen to be a creative person, or if you happen to be someone who's profoundly interested in ideas, you are in a pronounced minority, just as you are if you happen to be extremely extroverted or extremely agreeable or extremely conscientious. These are minority issues, and what you do is you find like-minded people who are capable of engaging that. Heavyweight weightlifters compete with heavyweight weightlifters for a reason, and everyone thinks that's fine, and the same thing applies to intellectual and creative endeavors. So what you do is you try to find a community where that's the nature of the community, and you likely have to find a relationship like that as well. So I don't think so. I think what contributes to the siloing is the arrogance that goes along with it. Because if you can be interested in ideas and you can be creative, well, that's the arrogance of the intellect, right? That's the thing the Catholic Church had warned about for centuries, is the arrogance of the intellect. So because if you're wise as well as smart, and there is no relationship between being smart and being wise, they are not the same thing. There's no quick pathway from smart to wise. And many of the people who I've known who were very wise some of them were intellectually impaired and were still wise, So it's the arrogance that brings up the block. And I see this, for example, happening in the United States in particular, because the last time I went down there, for example, I had friends down there, and some of those friends are very, very smart people, and some of them were talking about the Trump voters, and they were talking about the Trump voters with contempt. And I thought, you better watch that, because that's 50% of the damn population. And it might be convenient to think that they're stupid and beneath you, but it's not conducive to a civil state, and there's no evidence that it's true, because there isn't a straight line between intelligent and wise. And so I think that if your character is developed and you're intelligent, you can have your siloed creative community, but you develop enough wisdom so that you can see all the things that people can do that are of high ethical utility that are outside the intellectual domain. And I think that's why in the New Testament, I think that's why Christ is a carpenter. Right? Because, well, first of all, a carpenter is one of those jobs that when you're dishonest, it manifests itself immediately, because what you build falls down. And so if you're an honest carpenter, you build a good house. So there's a nice metaphor there. But it's also a warning, in some sense, against the equation of intellectual brilliance with moral superiority. And so if the intellects would drop their moral superiority, and fat chance there is of that, then the divide between the working class, say, and the elite would resolve. And there's every reason to have respect for decent working class people. I mean, it's on their labor, as the left-wingers at least hypothetically agree, that the entire edifice of the culture is resting. So you can have your cake and eat it too, but you have to not assume that your niche makes you superior. And it's very difficult for smart people, especially smart. There's this scene in Nietzsche's, it's in Thus Spake Zarathustra, where Zarathustra, the prophet, comes down from the mountain, and he comes into a public square, and there's this crowd around this little midget who's only about this high, who has a gigantic ear, and everyone is marveling at him. Well, that's what the modern intellect is like. It's a midget with a giant, well, mouth generally, not an ear. And the being is underdeveloped, but the intellect is hyper activated. And it makes the person extraordinarily unbalanced. And it's partly because they can't compete outside the intellectual realm. And that makes them very bitter, because they tend to think, well, God, I'm so smart, everything should just come to me. It's like, sorry, that's not how the world works. And it also, that attitude is immediately evident to people that they're talking to when they talk in the manner that they talk, if they are arrogant intellectuals of that sort. You see that in The Simpsons did a good job of that with Comic Book Guy, right? I mean, He completely useless in every possible dimension with an IQ of about 160. And it's very annoying to people who have an IQ of 160 that they can also be completely useless. But it happens a lot. So, yeah. There's this old idea that you go into the abyss. It's an idea that you can gaze into the abyss. You gaze long, and what you find in the abyss is a monster. That's the dragon at the bottom of the abyss, let's say. That's Satan himself, for that matter. But if you go into that as deeply as you can, what you find is you find your fragmented father in a comatose condition, in a desiccated and separated condition. And then you revivify that. Well, what does that mean? It means something. It means that if you look in the darkness, you find the light. That's one thing it means. And that the light really stands out against the darkness, but that the light is to be found in the darkness. So that's a very interesting thing. That's a quest narrative. But it means more than that. It means something fundamental. So we know, for example, that if you take yourself out of your current state of predictability and safety, and you put yourself in a new situation, you'll learn, right? You'll incorporate new information. So that's a cognitive issue. But that isn't all that happens. What happens is that new genes turn on within you and code for the production of new proteins. And that happens neurologically. New parts of you turn on. And so the idea is that if you can move yourself out into the world and push yourself out against a maximum array of challenges, more and more of you turns on. And then the question would be, well, what would you be if all of you that could be turned on was turned on? And the answer would be, you would be the resurrection of the ancestral father. That's what you would be. What that means is that if you take on the unbearable burden of being voluntarily, then that transforms you into the ancestral father. And that's true. And so that's unbelievably optimistic. It's so interesting because it's dark beyond belief. Well, the world is characterized by suffering and by malevolence of a depth that's virtually beyond comprehension. But if you choose to comprehend that, what you discover in that is the light that destroys the darkness. And that's really something to discover. There isn't a discovery that's more profound than that. That's the search for the Holy Grail or the Philosopher's Stone, all of that. It's very helpful for people to hear that they should make themselves competent and dangerous and take their proper place in the world.
Competent and dangerous?
Mm-hmm.
Why dangerous?
Because it's the alternative to being weak. And weak is not good. The people who shoot up the high schools, they're weak. They're weak.
How is it good to be dangerous?
Because it makes you formidable. And life is a very difficult process. And you're not prepared for it unless you have the capacity to be dangerous. That doesn't mean that you should be cruel. It doesn't mean any of that. There's a statement in the New Testament, the meek shall inherit the earth. But the meek isn't well translated. It means something more like, those who have swords and know how to use them but keep them sheathed will inherit the world. That's a way better way of thinking about it. You have to be powerful and formidable and then peaceful, in that order. And that's not the same as being naive and weak and harmless, which is what young men are being encouraged to be. It's like, that's a very bad idea. It's a very bad idea. Because naive, weak, and harmless means that you can't withstand the tragedies of life. You can't bear any responsibility. You'll end up bitter. And when you get bitter, then you get dangerous.
But one thing I'm not getting, there's a big difference between letting people do something for themselves and saying men should be dangerous. By dangerous, that implies I should be ready to threaten someone, to hurt somebody.
No, you should be capable of it. But that doesn't mean you should use it. There's nothing to you otherwise. Like if you're not a formidable force, there's no morality in your self-control. If you're incapable of violence, not being violent isn't a virtue. People who teach martial arts know this full well, right? If you learn a martial art, you learn to be dangerous, but simultaneously you learn to control it. Both of those come together. And the combination of that capacity for danger and the capacity for control is what brings about the virtue. Otherwise you confuse weakness with moral virtue. I'm harmless, therefore I'm good. It's like, no. That isn't how it works. That isn't how it works at all. If you're harmless, you're just weak. And if you're weak, you're not going to be good. You can't be, because it takes strength to be good. It's very difficult to be good.
People are afraid of the truth because often if you reveal it, it causes conflict in the moment. Telling the truth is definitely an adventure. Seeking for sure, but also telling. Another way of going about it is to just say what you think and see what happens. That's an adventure because you don't know what the outcome is going to be. So look, there's this old idea that it's necessary to have faith in the truth. And so here's a way of thinking about that. Someone asks you a question and you might think, well, here's the outcome I want, and so here's how I'm going to answer that question. So that's one way of approaching it. But another way of approaching it is, you ask me a question, I'm going to think about the answer, and I'm just going to tell you what I think. And it doesn't matter what the outcome is, because I'm willing to see what the outcome will be, predicated on the idea that there isn't a better outcome than the one that truth produces. Even if it's harsh and terrible in the short term, and sometimes it is, it's like there isn't a better way of doing it. Now, you might say, well, how do you know that? And the answer is, well, I don't know that. That's why it's an article of faith, because I believe, and I believe this deeply, the being that you produce as a consequence of telling the truth is good, by definition, even though it's harsh and often uncomfortable, because you get in trouble. One of the things that I've really learned recently, or learned to articulate better, is that there's a very tight relationship between aspiration and responsibility. The first question might be, do you need to aspire to something? And the answer is, well, yes, because you have to do something. If you just sit there, you'll die. You can't just sit there. You have to go act out in the world. Okay, so act towards what? Well, that's whatever your aspiration is. You have to have an aim. Okay, well, what should the aim be? Well, it should be something worth doing, let's say. Why do something that you don't feel is worth doing? What do you think's worth doing? Well, if you watch other people and you judge when they're doing something worthwhile, you usually judge them positively if you see that they're taking responsibility, at least for themselves. What, do you want to be completely useless so other people have to take care of you? That's pretty pathetic. And maybe you could get your act together so you're taking care of yourself and your family. And maybe you could even do better than that and take care of yourself and your family and your community. Well, good for you. That's responsibility, and that's an aim. Well, here's one of the things that's cool about that, is that your life doesn't have meaning without aspiration or an aim. Okay, so you need a hierarchy of values. There's got to be something at the top. It's got to be something important. If you don't have that, your life doesn't have any meaning. So if you criticize the hierarchy, or even the idea of hierarchy, you destroy the idea of aspiration, and then people have nothing. Well, that's not helpful. People are built for a struggle and they're built for a weight, and you want to take on a heavy burden voluntarily. See if you can put yourself together. See what you can do out in the world while you're waiting to die. It's an all-in game. It better be worthwhile. You need a family, you need friends. Like, you don't need to have all these things, but you better have most of them. Family, friends, career, educational goals, plans for, time outside of work, attention to your mental and physical health, etc. That's what life is about. And if you don't have any of those things, well, then all you've got left is misery and suffering. So that's a bad deal for you. So, number one, specify your damn goals, because how are you going to hit something if you don't know what it is? That isn't going to happen. And often people won't specify their goals too, because they don't like to specify conditions for failure. So if you keep yourself all vague and foggy, which is real easy, because that's just a matter of not doing as well, then you don't know when you fail. And people might say, well, I really don't want to know when I fail because that's painful, so I'll keep myself blind about when I fail. That's fine, except you'll fail all the time then. You just won't know it until you've failed so badly that you're done. And that can easily happen by the time you're 40. You would like to be productive and have a good life, and that's how you make the schedule. It's like, and then you look at the day and you think, well, if I had that day, that'd be good. Great, and you're useless and horrible, so you'll probably only hit it with about 70% accuracy, but that beats the hell out of 0, right? And if you hit it even with 50% accuracy, another rule is, well, aim for 51% the next week, or 50.5% for God's sake, because you're going to hit that position where things start to loop back positively and spiral you upward. So that's one way that you can work on your conscientiousness, is to plan a life you'd like to have. And you do that partly by referring to social norms. That's more or less rescuing your father from the belly of the whale. But the other way you do that is by having a little conversation with yourself about, as if you don't really know who you are, because you know what you're like. You won't do what you're told. You won't do what you tell yourself to do. You must have noticed that. It's like you're a bad employee and a worse boss, and both of those work for you. You don't know what you want to do, and then when you tell yourself what to do, you don't do it anyways. But, you know, my point is that you have to understand that you're not your own servant, so to speak. You're someone that you have to negotiate with. And you're someone that you want to present the opportunity of having a good life to. And that's hard for people because they don't like themselves very much. They're always like cracking the whip and then procrastinating, and cracking the whip and then procrastinating. And it's like, God, it's so boring and such a pathetic way of spending your time. And you know what that's like because you probably waste like 6 hours a day. What you do now is going to multiply its effects in the future. So, and you need to know what your damn time is worth. One of the things you should be asking yourself is, when you spend an hour, was that, well, what if I paid someone $50 to have had that hour? And if the answer is no, it's like, well, maybe you should do something else with your time. And it depends on whether or not you think that your time's worthwhile. But the funny thing about not assuming that is, if you assume your time isn't worthwhile, what happens is you don't just sit around sort of randomly in a state of responsibility-less bliss. What you do is you suffer existentially. Someone who is incapable of cruelty is a higher moral being than someone who is capable of cruelty. And I would say, and this follows Jung as well, that that's incorrect, and it's dangerously incorrect, because if you are not capable of cruelty, you are absolutely a victim to anyone who is. And so part of the reason that people go watch anti-heroes and villains is because there's a part of them crying out for the incorporation of the monster within them, which is what gives them strength of character and self-respect, because it's impossible to respect yourself until you grow teeth. And if you grow teeth, then you realize that you're somewhat dangerous, or maybe somewhat seriously dangerous, and then you might be more willing to demand that you treat yourself with respect and other people do the same thing. And so that doesn't mean that being cruel is better than not being cruel. What it means is that being able to be cruel and then not being cruel is better than not being able to be cruel. Because in the first case, you're nothing but weak and naive. And in the second case, you're dangerous, but you have it under control. And you know, a lot of martial arts concentrate on exactly that as part of their philosophy of training. It's like, we're not training you to fight. We're training you to be peaceful and awake and avoid fights. But if you happen to have to get in one, and I guess the philosophy also is that if you're competent at fighting, that actually decreases the probability that you're going to have to fight, because when someone pushes you, you'll be able to respond with confidence, and with any luck, and this is certainly the case with bullies, with any luck, a reasonable show of confidence, which is very much equivalent to a show of dominance, is going to be enough to make the bully back off. And so the strength that you develop in your monstrousness is actually the best guarantee of peace. And that's partly why Jung believed that it was necessary for people to integrate their shadow. And he said that was a terrible thing for people to attempt, because the human shadow, which is all those things about yourself that you don't want to realize, reaches all the way to hell. And what he meant by that was, it's through an analysis of your own shadow that you can come to understand why other people are capable, and you as well, of the sorts of terrible atrocities that characterized, let's say, the 20th century. And without that understanding, there's no possibility of bringing it under control. When you study Nazi Germany, for example, or you study the Soviet Union, particularly under Stalin, and you're asking yourself, well, what are these perpetrators like? Forget about the victims, let's talk about the perpetrators. The answer is, they're just like you. And if you don't know that, that just means that you don't know anything about people, including yourself. And then it also means that you have to discover why they're just like you. And believe me, that's no picnic. So that's enough to traumatize people, and that's partly why they don't do it. And it's also partly why the path to enlightenment and wisdom is seldom trod upon, because if it was all a matter of following your bliss and doing what made you happy, then everyone in the world would be a paragon of wisdom. But it's not that at all. It's a matter of facing the thing you least want to face. But the young men really need to hear this more, I think, is that you should be a monster. You know, because everyone says, well, you should be harmless, virtuous. You shouldn't do anyone any harm. You should sheath your competitive instinct. You shouldn't try to win. You know, you don't want to be too aggressive. You don't want to be too assertive. You want to take a back seat and all of that. It's like, no. Wrong. You should be a monster, an absolute monster, and then you should learn how to control it. If you're harmless, you're not virtuous. You're just harmless. You're like a rabbit. A rabbit isn't virtuous. It just can't do anything except get eaten. It's not virtuous. If you're a monster and you don't act monstrously, then you're virtuous. But you also have to be a monster. Well, you see this all the time. Harry Potter's like that too. It's like he's flawed, he's hurt, he's got evil in him. He can talk to snakes, man. He breaks rules all the time. All the time. He's not obedient at all. But, you know, he has a good reason for breaking the rules. And if he couldn't break the rules, him and his little clique of rule-breaking, you know, troublemakers, if they didn't break the rules, they wouldn't attain the highest goal. So it's very peculiar, but it's a very, 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 very common mythological notion. You know, the hero has to be a monster, but a controlled monster. Batman is like that, you know. I mean, it's everywhere. It's the story you always hear. Someone who is incapable of cruelty is a higher moral being than someone who is capable of cruelty. And I would say, and this follows Jung as well, that that's incorrect, and it's dangerously incorrect, because if you are not capable of cruelty, you are absolutely a victim to anyone who is. And so part of the reason that people go watch anti-heroes and villains is because there's a part of them crying out for the incorporation of the monster within them, which is what gives them strength of character and self-respect, because it's impossible to respect yourself until you grow teeth. And if you grow teeth, then you realize that you're somewhat dangerous, or maybe somewhat seriously dangerous, and then you might be more willing to demand that you treat yourself with respect and other people do the same thing. And so that doesn't mean that being cruel is better than not being cruel. What it means is that being able to be cruel and then not being cruel is better than not being able to be cruel. Because in the first case, you're nothing but weak and naive. And in the second case, you're dangerous, but you have it under control. And, you know, a lot of martial arts concentrate on exactly that as part of their philosophy of training. It's like, we're not training you to fight. We're training you to be peaceful and awake and avoid fights. But if you happen to have to get in one, and I guess the philosophy also is that if you're competent at fighting, that actually decreases the probability that you're going to have to fight, because when someone pushes you, you'll be able to respond with confidence, and with any luck, and this is certainly the case with bullies, with any luck, a reasonable show of confidence, which is very much equivalent to a show of dominance, is going to be enough to make the bully back off. And so the strength that you develop in your monstrousness is actually the best guarantee of peace. And that's partly why Jung believed that it was necessary for people to integrate their shadow. And he said that was a terrible thing for people to attempt, because the human shadow, which is all those things about yourself that you don't want to realize, reaches all the way to hell. And what he meant by that was, it's through an analysis of your own shadow that you can come to understand why other people are capable, and you as well, of the sorts of terrible atrocities that characterized, let's say, the 20th century. And without that understanding, there's no possibility of bringing it under control. When you study Nazi Germany, for example, or you study the Soviet Union, particularly under Stalin, and you're asking yourself, well, what are these perpetrators like? Forget about the victims, let's talk about the perpetrators. The answer is, they're just like you. And if you don't know that, that just means that you don't know anything about people, including yourself. And then it also means that you have to discover why they're just like you. And believe me, that's no picnic. So that's enough to traumatize people, and that's partly why they don't do it. And it's also partly why the path to enlightenment and wisdom is seldom trod upon, because if it was all a matter of following your bliss and doing what made you happy, then everyone in the world would be a paragon of wisdom. But it's not that at all. It's a matter of facing the thing you least want to face. If you're going to be a fighter, you have to want to win. And you have to want to hurt people. I mean, not for the sake of hurting them. That's what makes you different than an evil person. But you have to have that capacity. You have to develop that. And, you know, that's the step on the way to enlightenment, weirdly enough, because that isn't what people think. People have been fed this diet of pablum rights and impulsive freedom for so long, there's just an absolute starvation for the other side of the story. There are no rights, technically speaking, without responsibilities. And all we've had for 60 years is a dialogue about rights. Well, that leaves a hole on the other side of the story. And it's a hole that's in people's hearts, essentially. Because responsibility, well, perhaps that's not more important than rights. Like I said, they're part and parcel of the same formula. But it's in responsibility that most people find the meaning that sustains them through life. It's not in happiness. It's not an impulsive pleasure. Those things blow away at the first ill wind. But to adopt the responsibility for your own well-being and to try to put your family together and to try to serve your community and to try to seek for eternal truths and to live them, that's the sort of thing that can ground you in your life enough so that you can withstand the difficulty of life. And when you tell people that, especially when you include yourself in the audience, let's say, and you're not finger waving from above, then everyone knows that it's true. There's been this attempt to identify masculine competence and power, let's say, but mostly competence with tyranny, and that's very, very hard on young men. It's also hard on young women, for that matter, but it's very helpful for people to hear that they should make themselves competent and dangerous and take their proper place in the world, because it's the alternative to being weak. And weak is not good. The people who shoot up the high schools, they're weak. They're weak. And life is a very difficult process, and you're not prepared for it unless you have the capacity to be dangerous. That doesn't mean that you should be cruel. It doesn't mean any of that. There's a statement in the New Testament, the meek shall inherit the earth. But the meek isn't well translated. It means something more like, those who have swords and know how to use them but keep them sheathed will inherit the world. That's a way better way of thinking about it. You have to be powerful and formidable and then peaceful, in that order, right? And that's not the same as being naive and weak and harmless, which is what young men are being encouraged to be. It's like, that's a very bad idea. It's a very bad idea, because naive, weak, and harmless means that you can't withstand the tragedies of life. You can't bear any responsibility. You'll end up bitter. And when you get bitter, then you get dangerous. You don't treat adult men as if they're infants. You most want to find will be found where you least want to look. There's this old story that's from King Arthur, and King Arthur has these knights, right? They all sit around a round table, which means they're roughly equal. That's what the round table means. And they're off to find the Holy Grail, and the Holy Grail is the most valuable object. That's what it means. So they're off to find the most valuable thing, but they don't know what it is, and they don't know where it is. But they know that there's a most valuable thing, so in some sense it's akin to them orienting themselves by the star. And they don't know where to look, and so what they decide is, they have the castle, and it's the middle of a forest, and so each knight decides to start looking for the Holy Grail by entering the forest at the point that looks darkest to him. And so what's the idea there? Well, imagine there are things that come easy to you, and that you're fond of pursuing, and that you're happy about pursuing. So you've found those and pursued them, and you've mastered them. So you know all that, but then there's another place that you don't want to go. And so you haven't gone there, and you haven't mastered it, and you're very small in comparison to it because you haven't mastered it, and so it has this monstrous aspect. If what you're doing isn't working, it's where you haven't gone that you need to go. And so I can give you another example of this. So let's say you're an agreeable person, and so you don't like conflict, and you won't stand up for yourself, and you regard anger and the proclivity to provoke and to engage in conflict as something that's positively terrible. It's not only that you're not good at it, it's actually that it's wrong. So that's where you have to go if you're going to learn how to stand up for yourself. And imagine that you're afraid. Maybe you have something like agoraphobia. So there's a whole bunch of things that you're afraid of, and you don't want to go there. But if you want to put yourself together, then that's exactly where you have to go. And so it's frequently the case that what you want to find is to be found where you least want to find it. And that idea is echoed in the prominent stories of dragons and gold. It's exactly the same idea. The dragon is this terrible thing. It's this terrible predatory thing that lives forever and is very, very wise. And it lives underground, and it'll kill you. It'll burn you up in a second. But it hoards gold. And so you have to go there into the dragon's lair if you're going to get the gold. And that's a representation of people's paradoxical relationship with reality. It's like you have to go out there and confront it in order to incorporate what it has to offer to you. But the probability that that's going to be intensely dangerous and push you right to the limit, first of all, those are actually the same thing. If it didn't push you to the limit, you wouldn't gain anything valuable from it. So you don't get one without the other. You don't get the gold without the dragon. That's a very strange, very, very strange idea. But it seems to be accurate. So all of that's lurking underneath this, in this imagery of the whale. Now, the whale, you can think of the story of Jonah. What happens with Jonah is that, roughly speaking, he's a prophet, and God tells him that he has to go to this city and straighten it out because it's veered off the path and it's heading towards doom. And Jonah thinks, I'm not going to that city to tell those people anything like that because they're not going to be very happy with me just showing up there and telling them, you know, everything they're doing wrong. And so he hops on a boat and tries to get out of there. And then God conjures up this huge storm and the boat is about to be swamped. And Jonah admits that it's actually his fault because God's upset with him because he got this direct command to go straighten out the city and he ran off. And so they're not happy about this, but they throw Jonah overboard and the seas calm and great fish comes up, a whale, and swallows him. And then he's down in the fish for 3 days and it throws him up on the dry land. And then he's learned his lesson by that time and he goes off to pursue his proper destiny. So that's echoed in this story as well, that if you don't follow the pathway that you're supposed to follow, the seas will become stormy for you and something will come up and pull you down and you'll be in a terrible place for some length of time till you learn your lesson. And if you're lucky, you'll get spit back up on shore and then you can go do what you should do. Well, I mean, that's not a lesson that anybody needs to have interpreted. I think everybody understands that. Part of spiritual development is to recognize the satanic tendencies that characterize you and to fully wrestle with them and to integrate them. That's the thing. It's not so much to cast them away, it's to transmute them. You know, and you can see the difference between people who've done that and people who haven't, at least to some degree, because people who haven't integrated the shadow at all are naive. And you can tell that when you look at them, and you can tell that when you talk to them. And because they're naive, they're often resentful as well because they get taken advantage of. And someone who's integrated that more, they're dangerous in the martial arts sort of way, which is they're dangerous, but they don't have to use it because their presence radiates implicit potential for havoc, and that's really necessary. It's one of the things that gives people self-respect. Well, I'll tell you a couple of strange things, things that I don't really understand. The first is, when we've done the analysis of the effects of the future authoring program, it has had a differential impact on men, and it's had a particularly differential impact on what I would call excluded men. And so that would be non-Western ethnic minority men, or what, majority men who aren't doing very well. So for example, at Mohawk College, the future authoring program had a particularly robust effect on Mohawk College students who were men who hadn't done very well in high school and who hadn't picked a major that had a destination, a career destination at its end. So you can imagine those people they have an ambiguous relationship with the idea of education. And they're not oriented specifically towards a goal. They're not very motivated. Now, why did it have a differential effect on men? That's a good question. Well, first of all, the women are doing better. So it might just be a matter of the fact that it does better for people who aren't doing as well, and at the moment most of them are men. I think that might be part of it, but I don't believe that's all of it. I think that part of the reason that women are doing better is because they're agreeable. And so if a system sets out a structure and says, here's a pathway to attainment, the women won't rebel against that, they'll go along with it, and that's working very well for them at the moment. The men, especially the men on the disagreeable end of the distribution, and there's way more men on the disagreeable end of the distribution than there are women, right? That's what you get from, if you look at overlapping normal distributions. So there's the female distribution for agreeableness, male distribution for agreeableness. Tremendous overlap. Okay, women are higher. All the really agreeable people are women. All the really disagreeable people are men. And maybe the real differences occur at the extremes, right? And it's a very interesting side effect of overlapping distributions. So people can be mostly the same, but that can still produce radical differences. Disagreeable men won't do anything they don't want to do. They just say, up yours. I'll go home and play video games. Are you with you? I'm not listening to your stupid classes. And why should I work for you? I'll just go have fun. I'll do my own thing. I don't think they're motivated. And so then if you take the men who are like that and you say, okay, what do you want? You can have what you want, but you have to figure out what it is. So then they write down what they want and they think, oh, hey, well, that might be worth having, so maybe I'll put some effort into it. That's what it looks like to me. Now, that's weak evidence. And this is a weak argument. But I'm trying to stretch out my understanding to account for this. But I'll tell you something else that's really weird. I don't understand this either. So more than 90% of the people who watch my videos on YouTube are men. Now that's weird because about 80% of psychology students are women. So that is not what you would expect, right? You would expect that the majority of them would be women. And you might say, well, it's because of the political stance I've taken. And I thought, well, that's possible. So I went and looked at the demographic data because I have that. Well, before I did any of the political videos, 85% of my viewers were men. So it's actually increased a bit. It's increased by 6%. And that's not trivial, but it was still overwhelmingly men. So that was interesting. I thought, what the hell? Why is that exactly? And then now I've been watching crowds when I've been talking to them. And the crowds that have come to see me in person. This happened at the University of Toronto free speech debate. And I actually noticed it and commented on it before the debate took place because I was talking about intrinsic differences between men and women. And I looked around the room and I thought, hey, 80% of the people in this room are men. So I had all the women stand up and then all the men stand up. I said, look, like, here's a natural experiment. For some reason, 80% of the people who showed up to this are men. Now, everybody thought I was kind of cracked to do that. And it was a risk, but I thought, no, there's something going on here. And then what's interesting now is that every public appearance that I've made that's related to the sort of topics that we're discussing is overwhelmingly men. It's like 85 to 90%. And so I thought, wow, that's weird. Like, what the hell's going on here exactly? And then the other thing I've noticed is that I've been talking a lot to the crowds that I've been talking to, not about rights, but about responsibility, right? Because you can't have the bloody conversation. What are you doing? You can't have the conversation about rights without the conversation about responsibility because your rights are my responsibility. That's what they are, technically. So you just can't have only half of that discussion. And we're only having half that discussion. And the question is, well, what the hell are you leaving out if you only have that half of the discussion? And the answer is, well, you're leaving out responsibility. And then the question is, well, what are you leaving out if you're leaving out responsibility? And the answer might be, well, maybe you're leaving out the meaning of life. That's what it looks like to me. It's like, here you are, suffering away. What makes it worthwhile? Rights? You're completely out. You have no idea what it's almost impossible to describe how bad an idea that is. Responsibility. That's what gives life meaning. It's like lift a load. Then you can tolerate yourself, right? Because look at, you're useless, easily hurt, easily killed. Why should you have any self-respect? That's the story of the fall. Pick something up and carry it. Make it heavy enough so that you can think, yeah, well, useless as I am, at least I could move that from there to there. Well, what's really cool about that is that when I talk to these crowds about this, the men's eyes light up. And that's I've seen that phenomenon because I've been talking about this mythological material for a long time. And I can see when I'm watching crowds, people, their eyebrows lift, their eyes light up because I put something together for them. And that's what mythological stories do. So I'm not taking responsibility for that. That's what the stories do. So I say the story and people go click, 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 and their eyes light up. But this responsibility thing, that's a whole new order of this, is that young men are so hungry for that, it is unbelievable. And one of the things I've been talking to some of the people who've been running for the Conservative leadership in Canada, and I've been talking to them about, well, the difficulties they have communicating with young people because Conservatives, what the hell are they going to sell to young people, right? Because being Conservative is something that happens when you're older. They can sell responsibility. No one's selling it. And the thing is, for men, there's nothing but responsibility. I was watching The Simpsons the other day. I watched the first Simpsons episode, and I deconstructed it. And so it's really interesting. So what happens in the first Simpson episode is that it's Christmas, and Homer and Marge are going to buy some Christmas presents, but Homer doesn't get his Christmas bonus. And so he's absolutely crushed by that. And that actually is a recurring theme in The Simpsons, where Homer loses his job or something like that, or can't make enough money. He's completely crushed. Even though he's kind of useless, bumbling, laughing fool of a guy, you know, the thing that gives that show its soul is that he's still oriented towards his family. That's what makes him honorable, is that foolish as he is, he's decided to adopt responsibility for his family and to try to bear that. And so he's a holy fool. He's not a complete fool. And it's so interesting watching the story because he suffers dreadfully as a consequence of not being able to fulfill his responsibility. Well, that's for men. Women have their sets of responsibilities. They're not the same, right? Because they're complicated, because women, of course, have to take primary responsibility for having infants at least, but then also for caring for them. They're structured differently than men, for biological necessity, even if it's not a psychological issue, and it's also partly a psychological issue. Women know what they have to do. Men have to figure out what they have to do. And if they have nothing worth living for, then they stay Peter Pan. And why the hell not? Because the alternative to valued responsibility is impulsive, low-class pleasure. And you saw that in the Pinocchio story, right? That's Pleasure Island. It's like, well, why lift a load if there's nothing in it for you? That's another thing that we're doing to men that's a very bad idea. And to boys. It's like, you're pathological and oppressive. It's like, fine then, why the hell am I going to play? If that's the situation, if I get no credit for bearing responsibility, you can bloody well be sure I'm not going to bear any. But then, you know, your life is useless and meaningless, and you're full of self-contempt and nihilism, and that's not good. And so that's why I think, that's what I think's going on at a deeper level with regards to men needing this direction. A man has to decide that he's going to do something. He has to decide that. Yeah, well, you know, partly what you're trying to do in the future authoring process is say, okay, well, what's your highest value? Right? It's the star. It's like, okay, what are you aiming for? You can decide, man. But, you know, there's some criteria. It should be good for you. It should be good for you in a way that facilitates your moving forward. Maybe it should be good for you in a way that's also good for the family and the community. It should cover the domain of life. I mean, there's constraints on what you should regard as a value, but within those constraints you have the choice. You have choice. Well, the thing is that people will carry a heavy load if they get to pick the goddamn load. So, and they think, well, I won't carry any load. It's like, okay, fine, but then you're like the sled dog that doesn't have a sled to pull. You're gonna tear pieces out of your own legs because you're bored. You know, people are pack animals. They need to pull against a weight. And that's not true for everyone. It's not true particularly, say, for low conscientious people. I mean, maybe they're open and creative or extroverted and some other things. But for the typical person, they'll eat themselves up unless they have a load. This is why there's such an opiate epidemic among dispossessed white middle-aged guys who are unemployed in the US. It's like they lose their job, they're done, right? They despise themselves. They develop chronic pain syndromes and depression. And the chronic pain is treated with opiates. It's like, that's what we're doing. So, yeah, that's what it looks like to me. Is you have to, and it's so interesting to watch the young men when you talk to them about responsibility. They're so goddamn thrilled about it. It just blows me away. It's like, really? That's the counterculture. Grow the hell up and do something useful. Really? I could do that? Oh, I'm so excited by that idea. No one ever mentioned that before. It's like rights, 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 rights. Jesus, it's appalling. And I feel that that's deeply felt by the people who are coming out to listen to these sorts of things too. They've had enough of that. So, and they better have, because it's a non-productive mode of being. Responsibility, man. That's where the meaning in life is. So imagine you're dealing with someone who's hoarding. Now, people who are hoarding are often older or neurologically damaged, or they have obsessive compulsive disorder. But then you walk into their house and there's like 10,000 things in their house. There's maybe 100 boxes, and you open up a box, and in the box there's some pens and some old passports and some checks and their collection of silver dollars and some hypodermic needles and some dust and, you know, a dead mouse and there's boxes and boxes and boxes like that in the house. It's absolute chaos in there. Absolute chaos, not order, chaos. And then you think, is that their house or is that their being? Is that their mind? And the answer is, there's no difference. There's no difference. So, you know, I could say, well, if you want to organize your psyche, you could start by organizing your room. If that would be easier, because maybe you're a more concrete person and you need something concrete to do. So you go clean up under your bed and you make your bed and you organize the papers on your desk and you think, well, just exactly what are you organizing? Are you organizing the objective world, or are you objecting your field, or are you organizing your field of being, like your field of total experience? And Jung believed that, and I think there's a Buddhist doctrine that's sort of nested in there, that at the highest level of psychological integration, there's no difference between you and what you experience. Now you think, well, I can't control everything I experience, but that's no objection, because you can't control yourself anyway. So the mere fact that you can't extend control over everything you experience is no argument against the idea that you should still treat that as an extension of yourself. So you could say, well, let's say you have a long-standing feud with your brother. Well, is that a psychological problem? Is that him? Is it a problem in the objective world, or is it a problem in your field of being? And it's very useful to think that way, because you might ask, what could you do to improve yourself? Well, let's step one step backwards. The first question might be, why should you even bother improving yourself? And I think the answer to that is something like, so you don't suffer any more stupidly than you have to. And maybe so others don't have to either. It's something like that. You know, like there's a real injunction at the bottom of it. It's not some casual self-help doctrine. It's that if you don't organize yourself properly, you'll pay for it, and in a big way, and so will the people around you. Now, and you could say, well, I don't care about that, but that's actually not true. You actually do care about that, because if you're in pain, you will care about it. And so you do care about it, even if it's just that negative way, you know. It's very rare that you can find someone who's in excruciating pain who would ever say, well, it would be no better if I was out of this. It's sort of, pain is one of those things that brings the idea that it would be better if it didn't exist along with it. It's incontrovertible. So you get your act together so that there isn't any more stupid pain around you than necessary. Well, so then the question might be, well, how would you go about getting your act together? And the answer to that, and this is a phenomenological idea too, it's something like, look around for something that bothers you and see if you can fix it. So now you think, well, let's say you go into you can do this in a room. It's quite fun to do it just when you're sitting in a room, like a room, maybe your bedroom. You can sit there and just sort of meditate on it and think, okay, if I wanted to spend 10 minutes making this room better, what would I have to do? And you have to ask yourself that, right? It's not a command, it's like a genuine question. And things will pop out in the room that you know, like there's a stack of papers over there that's kind of bugging you, and you know that maybe little order there would be a good thing, and you know, there's some rubbish behind your computer monitor that you haven't attended to for like 6 months, and the room would be slightly better if it was a little less dusty and the cables weren't all tangled up the same way. And like, if you allow yourself just to consider the expanse in which you exist at that moment, there'll be all sorts of things that'll pop out in it that you could just fix. And you know, I might say, well, if you were coming to see me for psychotherapy, the easiest thing for us to do first would just be to get you to organize your room. You think, well, is that psychotherapy? And the answer is, well, it depends on how you conceive the limits of your being. And I would say, start where you can start. You know, if something announces itself to you, which is a strange way of thinking about it, as in need of repair, that you could repair, then hey, fix it. You fix 100 things like that, your life will be a lot different. You know, I often tell people too, fix the things you repeat every day, because people tend to think of those as trivial, right? You get up, you brush your teeth, you have your breakfast, you know, you have your routines that you go through every day. Well, those probably constitute 50% of your life. And people think, well, they're mundane, I don't need to pay attention to them. It's like, no, that's exactly wrong. The things you do every day, those are the most important things you do. Hands down. All you have to do is do the arithmetic. You figure it out right away. So 100 adjustments to your broader domain of being, and there's a lot less rubbish around, and a lot fewer traps for you to step into. And so That's in keeping with Jung's idea about erasing once you've got your mind and your emotions together, and once you're acting that out, then you can extend what you're willing to consider yourself and start fixing up the things that are part of your broader extent. Now, sometimes you don't know how to do that. So you might say, imagine you're walking down Bloor Street and there's this guy who's like alcoholic and schizophrenic and has been on the streets for 10 years. He sort of stumbles towards you and, you know, incoherently mutters something. That's a problem. And it would be good if you could fix it, but you haven't got a clue about how to fix that. You just walk around that and go find something that you could fix, because if you muck about in that, not only is it unlikely that you'll help that person, it's very likely that you'll get hurt yourself. So, you know, just because while you're experiencing things announce themselves as in need of repair doesn't mean that it's you right then and there that should repair them. You have to have some humility. You know, you don't walk up to a helicopter that isn't working and just start tinkering away with it. You have to stay within your domain of competence. But most of the time, if people look at their lives, you know, it's a very interesting thing to do. I like the idea of the room, because you can do that at the drop of a hat. You know, you go back to where you live and sit down and think, okay, I'm going to make this place better for half an hour. What should I do? And you have to ask, and things will just pop up like mad. And it's partly because your mind is a very strange thing. As soon as you give it a name, a genuine aim, it'll reconfigure the world in keeping with that aim. That's actually how you see to begin with. And so if you set it a task, especially, you have to be genuine about it, which is why you have to bring your thoughts and emotions together, and then you have to get them in your body so you're acting consistently. You have to be genuine about the aim, but once you aim, the world will reconfigure itself around that aim, which is very strange. And it's technically true. You know, the best example of that, you have all seen this video where you watch the basketballs being tossed back and forth between members of the white team versus the black team, and while you're doing that, a gorilla walks up into the middle of the video and you don't see it. It's like, you know, if you thought about that experiment for about 5 years, that would be about the right amount of time to spend thinking about it, because what it shows you is that you see what you aim at. And that, man, if you can get one thing through your head as a consequence of even being in university, that would be a good one. You see what you aim at. And so, because one inference you might draw from that is, be careful what you aim at, right? What you aim at determines the way the world manifests itself to you. And so if the world is manifesting itself in a very negative way, one thing to ask is, are you aiming at the right thing? Now, you know, I'm not trying to reduce everybody's problems to an improper aim. People get cut off at the knees for all sorts of reasons. You know, they get sick, they have accidents. There's a random element to being, that's for sure. And so you don't want to take anything, even that particular phrase, too far. You want to bind it with the fact that random things do happen to people, but it's still a great thing to ask. Okay, so Rogers was a phenomenologist, and he was interested in, he didn't start his philosophy from the perspective of subject versus object, or from the idea of psyche, like sort of inside you, your mind with its layers. That's not how he looked at it. And so let's go through, well, I'll introduce you to Rogers. I think and then we'll talk about it more next time. I'm going to start, though, with something that I learned from him that I think was of crucial importance. And so we'll set the stage for the further discussion with this. And I'm going to read it to you. Assuming a minimal mutual willingness to be in contact and to receive communications, we may say that the greater the communicated congruence of experience, awareness, and behavior on the part of one individual, the more the ensuing relationship will involve a tendency towards reciprocal communication with the same qualities, mutually accurate understanding of the communications, improved psychological adjustment and functioning in both parties, and mutual satisfaction in the relationship. It's quite a mouthful. What does it mean? Assuming a minimal mutual willingness to be in contact and to receive communications. Okay, we're having a conversation. I'm deciding I'm going to listen to you, right? That's different than how people generally communicate, because usually when they communicate, they're doing something like, okay, we're going to have a conversation and I'm going to tell you why I'm right and I'll win if you agree. Or maybe you're having a conversation where I don't know what you're trying to do. Maybe you're trying to impress the person you're talking to. So you're not listening to them at all. You're just thinking about what you're going to say next. Okay, so that's not this. This is, you might have something to tell me. And so I'm going to listen on the off chance that you'll tell me something that would really be useful for me to know. And so you could think about it as an extension of the Piagetian. You know, Piaget talked about the fundamentally important element of knowledge being to describe how knowledge is sought, the process by which knowledge is generated. Well, if you agree with me and I find that out, I know nothing more than I knew before. I just know what I knew before. And maybe I'm happy about that because, you know, it didn't get challenged. But I'm no smarter than I was before. But maybe you're different than me, and so while I'm listening to you, you'll tell me something I don't like. Maybe it's something I find contemptible or difficult, whatever. Maybe you'll tell me something I don't know, and then I won't be quite as stupid. And then maybe I won't run painfully into quite as many things. And that's a really useful thing to know, especially if you live with someone and you're trying to make long-term peace with them, is they're not the same as you. And their way they look at the world and the facts that they pull out of the world aren't the same as your facts. And even though you're going to be overwhelmed with the proclivity to demonstrate that you're right, it is the case that two brains are better than one. And so maybe 9 of the 10 things they tell you are dispensable, or maybe even 49 out of 50, but one thing, all you need to get out of the damn conversation is one thing you don't know. And one of the things that's very cool about a good psychotherapeutic session is that the whole conversation is like that. All you're doing is trying to express the truth of the situation as clearly as possible. That's it. And so now Roger's proposition, and I'll tell you why he derived it, was that if you have a conversation like that with someone, it will make both of you better. It'll make both of you psychologically healthier. So there's an implicit presupposition that the exchange of truth is curative. Well, that's a very cool idea. I mean, it's a very deep idea. I think it's the most profound idea. It's the idea upon which Western civilization, although not only Western civilization, is actually predicated. The idea that truth produces health. But for Rogers, that was the entire purpose of the Psychotherapeutic Alliance. You come to see me because you want to be better. You don't even know what that means necessarily, neither do I. We're going to figure that out together. But you come and you say, look, things are not acceptable to me, and maybe there's something I could do about that. So that's the minimal precondition to engage in therapy. Something's wrong, you're willing to talk about it truthfully, and you want it to be better. Without that, the therapeutic relationship does not get off the ground. And so then you might ask, well, what relationships are therapeutic? And the answer to that would be, if you have a real relationship, it's therapeutic. If it isn't, what you have is not a relationship. God only knows what you have. You're a slave, they're a tyrant, you know, you're both butting heads with one another. It's a primate dominance hierarchy dispute. Oh, I don't know, you're like 2 cats in a barrel, or 2 people with their hands around each other's throats. But what you have is not a relationship. So, all right. We may say that the greater the communicated congruence of experience, awareness, and behavior on the part of one individual, that's a reference to the same idea that I was describing with regards to Jung. So let's say you come and talk to me and you want things to go well. Well, I'm going to have to more or less be one thing, because if I'm all over the place, you can't trust any continuity in what I say. There's no reason for you to believe that I'm capable of actually telling you, I'm capable of expressing anything that's true. So the truth is something that emerges as a consequence of getting yourself lined up and beating all the, what would you call, all the impurities out of your soul. Assuming you want to get better, there's usually something you can figure out that would constitute a step towards some sort of concrete goal. And my presumption, it's a behavioral presumption fundamentally, is that small accruing gains that repeat are unbelievably powerful. You can tyrannize yourself into doing things, but I wouldn't recommend it. What I would recommend instead is that you ask yourself what you're willing to do. It's a really effective technique. It's like a meditative technique. So for example, You can get up in the morning and you can think, well, you know, I'd like to have a good day today, so I'd like to go to bed tonight without feeling guilty because I, you know, didn't do some things I said I was going to do, and I'd like to have kind of an interesting day. So you got to fulfill my responsibilities, and I want to, you know, enjoy the day. Then you can ask yourself, well, what would I have to do in order for that to happen that I would do? And the probability, if you practice this for 3 or 4 days, is your brain will just tell you. It'll say, well, you know, there's that piece of homework that you haven't done for like 3 weeks. You should knock that sucker off because it would only take you 10 minutes and you've been avoiding it and torturing yourself to death for 72 hours straight. And say, well, let's figure out what your aims are. You got to have some aims, whatever they are. And they might say, well, I'm so depressed I don't have any aims. And then I say, well, pick the least objectionable of the aims and act it out for a while and see what happens. Because sometimes your emotional systems are so fouled up that you have to pretend. You have to act the thing out before you can start to believe it. Life can be meaningful enough to justify its suffering. I thought, God, that's such a good idea. Because it's not optimistic exactly. You know, some people will tell you, well, you can be happy. It's like, those people are idiots. I'm telling you, they're idiots. There's going to be things that come along that flatten you so hard you won't believe it. And you're not happy then. And so if life is to be happy, well, in those situations, what are you doing? Why even live? But life isn't to be happy. If you're happy, you're bloody fortunate, and you should enjoy it. You should, because it's the grace of God, so to speak. People know when they're doing something meaningful. They can tell, so why the hell don't they do meaningful things all the time? It seems obvious. You could do it. I mean, it's hard, you know, because other people want you to do other things, and it's a struggle, but everything's a struggle. Oh, I get it. I see why. It took me about 10 years to figure this out. People have a choice. Choice number 1. Nothing you do means anything. Well, that's kind of a drag, right? It's meaninglessness of life and all that, existential angst. You know, that's kind of a pain. But the upside of nothing that you do is meaningful is you don't have to do anything. You've got no responsibility. Now, you have to suffer because things are meaningless, but that's a small price to pay. The alternative is everything you do matters. Really. If you make a mistake, it's a real mistake. If you betray someone, you tilt the world a little more sharply towards evil rather than good. It matters what you do. Well, if you buy that, then you can have a meaningful life. But there's no mucking around. It means responsibility. It means that the decisions you make are important. It means that when you do something wrong, it's wrong. Well, do you want that?